Hey guys, today I want to tell you a strange and slightly chilling story about the final days of Queen Elizabeth I. She ruled England for 45 years, transforming it from a fragile kingdom into a formidable empire. But in the end, Elizabeth did not pass away amid applause, but in silence, loneliness, and a very human fear. No heroic declaration, no historic last words. She simply stood still and gradually faded away from the world. Records from the time say she refused to lie down for days, afraid that if she did, she would never wake up again. And indeed, she stood like that until her body no longer had the strength to keep her alive. Have you ever wondered, what could make such a powerful woman feel fear like a child? Was it illness, the dread of aging, or the weight of past decisions coming back to haunt her? In this video, we'll explore every small detail to understand what really happened. And if you find untold historical stories like this one fascinating, don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the bell so you won't miss the next part. Back to the story. It was spring of 1603 at Richmond Palace, where Elizabeth spent her final days. She wouldn't let doctors in, wouldn't allow anyone to mention death, and wouldn't let anyone touch her. The servants were only allowed to stand outside, listen quietly, and wait for something. But nothing came. No cries of pain, no calls for help. Only an old woman standing motionless, eyes wide open, not knowing if she was still alive or slowly leaving. Many later said the room barely felt alive, as if life had slipped away long before anyone realized. For hours on end, she said nothing, ate nothing, drank nothing. She just stood there. Some say it was the final pride of a queen. Others believed it was a long, drawn-out delirium. But everyone agreed on one thing: no one had ever died in such a strange way. And what frightened people most was that no one dared to say she had died. Until several days later, the room where Elizabeth spent her last days didn't feel like a place for the living. It felt like a waiting room for death, but no one dared to say it aloud. Everything was covered in red velvet, but the curtains were always drawn, as if even sunlight was not allowed to disturb her. The chair by the window still bore dried tea stains. No one had seen her touch her final meal. No voices, no music, no signs of ordinary life. Servants were ordered not to enter unless called, but that call never came. She didn't lie down, didn't rest. For 3 straight days she stood without stepping even half a foot away. No one in the room dared admit they might be looking at someone who was already dead, but not yet declared. One servant whispered that her eyes were empty, unblinking, unresponsive, just staring into space. They kept replacing the candles, because she wouldn't allow the darkness to enter. But that light, some said, was even more terrifying. Some believed she was still conscious. Others thought she was already gone. Only her body hadn't collapsed yet. The royal physicians were present, but none dared step through the door. They left written messages, hoping for a reply, but no one knew if those notes were ever opened. Fear began creeping in, not just because she might have died, but because no one wanted to be the first to say it. A young maid said she tried to get close, to listen for breath, but in the end, she stepped back, too afraid of the answer she might hear. Because if the queen was still alive and angry, the consequences would not be pleasant at all. But no one wanted to just stand there, waiting in silence, in a room that felt like it had stopped breathing. Some rotated shifts, just to escape the feeling that the room itself was watching them. Elizabeth's fingers began to curl, her face sunken, yet no one made any official move. No cry of pain, no final words, no clear movement to confirm what had happened. They say there was a moment, just a few seconds, when the entire room fell into absolute stillness. Not because someone commanded it, but because everyone felt the time had come. An older maid burst into tears, only to be quickly told to remain silent. She didn't cry out of grief, but because no one had the courage to say, "Our queen is dead." No doctor confirmed it. No official record was written at that moment. Only absence, a hollow space stretching in the dim candlelight. A servant walked behind Elizabeth, exhaled gently, then softly called her name. There was no response, and that was when the room finally accepted what they had avoided for 3 days. Elizabeth I, the Queen of England, was gone. No grand ceremony, no ringing bells, no shouted announcement. Just prolonged silence, and glances that avoided meeting one another. Someone quietly closed the curtain, as if to shield the room just a little more. The candles still burned, but the light no longer felt warm. And the woman who once stood against the Pope, the Spanish army, and even the biases of her era, ended her life standing. No one spoke of it for many days afterward, as if acknowledging it was somehow taboo. Only when an official decision came from the Royal Council was her death formally announced. But by then, the rumor had already spread across the city. People said she had died 3 days before it was recognized. Some believed she was still alive for hours after being mistakenly thought dead. But others claimed everyone knew the truth. They just didn't want to be the first to say it. Because everyone feared that if they spoke too soon, they would bear the burden of a truth the nation wasn't ready for. After Elizabeth's death, people began to question the way she was cared for, and noticed something odd. No one had physically touched her during those final days, not due to a lack of doctors, but because they had all been trained to observe, not to act on anything uncertain. At the time, uncertain was just another way of saying, better leave it alone. Some believed that bloodletting might rebalance the body, but no one dared attempt that on the most powerful woman in the land. She didn't allow it either. Perhaps she knew that one more drop of blood would mean she'd collapse. There's also a theory that what truly ruined her health was the very makeup she wore every day. Venetian ceruse, a fashionable white powder, contained lead and mercury. She had used it since youth, and by the end of her life, she almost never appeared without a thick layer of it. Her skin had eroded, as thin as paper, yet the powder sat on top like a mask. One physician once wrote in his diary, "You could not tell by looking at her whether she was smiling in pain or no longer there." Many modern experts believe that toxins from her cosmetics slowly entered her bloodstream, causing organ failure. But to the physicians of her time, it was simply a constitutional issue. They prescribed rosewater, plasters, and a mix of herbal roots, with instructions to get some rest. No one dared suggest removing the white makeup. That was the last thing Elizabeth still had control over. Instead, they stood around her, as if waiting for a miracle or for someone else to take responsibility. One person proposed rosemary inhalation therapy, placing leaves in cloth bags and hanging them around the room. Another suggested lighting more candles, because light will help the soul stay. No one brought painkillers. No one spoke of death. They only noted weak pulse, shallow breath, unresponsive to voice, and they left her standing there, untouched, untreated, undiagnosed. Perhaps they feared being beheaded if Elizabeth suddenly woke up and they had given the wrong medicine. Or perhaps they simply did what the court expected: remain silent, protect her image, and wait for orders from above. During that time, the mercury jar remained on the dressing table as a silent reminder. It was a symbol of the price of beauty and power when combined with isolation. No one touched the jar. No one removed it. It was still there, even days after Elizabeth was taken from the room. A servant wrapped it in cloth, not out of fear of poisoning, but fear that she might come back for it. In a society that believed royals were half human, half divine, uttering the word dead about the queen was forbidden. Instead of a clear statement, they used the phrase, "She has entered eternal stillness." And in that stillness, England began to shift, though no one truly knew what would come next. At the time, no one thought much about mercury, lead, or symptoms. They only remembered that she stood for 3 days without falling, without speaking, without saying goodbye. And perhaps that's how Elizabeth wanted to be remembered. No one saw the moment she collapsed. No one kept that image. Those present agreed to erase that detail from all official records. They called it a passing fit for a queen. But the truth was, she had died, and no one had the courage to look it in the eye. For 45 years, Elizabeth had controlled everything. And in the end, she controlled how she disappeared from the world. Perhaps that was her final and loneliest victory. In her final days, Elizabeth didn't just stop eating. She refused all forms of physical care. She wouldn't let anyone touch her, wouldn't allow her clothes to be changed, and absolutely refused to bathe. This left her maids confused, but no one dared question her. They were only allowed to spray perfume around the room, hoping the scent would mask the truth. No one knew why she acted this way until a servant whispered, "She believes if she falls, she'll never get back up." It wasn't stubbornness. It was the very real fear of someone used to controlling everything. Elizabeth had lived her whole life under the eyes of others. In death, she didn't want anyone to see her weakened. Each time the maids brought in hot water, she simply shook her head and turned away. She wore the same black gown for days. A heavy, thick fabric, cold to the touch when temperatures dropped. No one dared ask if she was cold. No one offered to help her change. A maid once suggested, "May I help you lie down for a bit, Your Majesty?" But she gave no reply. She didn't lie down. She didn't sit. She didn't rest. Her back remained straight as a statue, her gaze fixed on the wall. One doctor observed, "That posture isn't a sign of vitality. It's defiance slowly wearing out." In court culture, the queen was a symbol, and symbols were not allowed to collapse in front of others. Elizabeth understood that better than anyone. Even when her hands began to tremble, she hid them beneath her gown. When her knees could no longer bear weight, she gently leaned on the bed frame, but never asked for help. It was a silent battle between a body breaking down and a will that refused to surrender. Some said she slept standing for moments. During those days, time lost its meaning. Day and night blurred together under candlelight. Servants rotated shifts, but no one dared speak unless spoken to. Elizabeth gave no orders, but her silence alone made everyone fall quiet. The bedroom became a waiting space. No one knew what they were waiting for, but they all felt it. The smell in the room began to change, from herbs to something indescribable. A servant trained in medicine tried to stay calm, but eventually asked to be reassigned. Candles burned out faster, as if the air itself had changed. Many couldn't bear it anymore, but still stood guard because no one wanted to be the first to leave. They said, "She's still alive. We cannot leave while she's still standing." And they were right. Elizabeth still stood, still unmoving, still unyielding. In a vast palace, among hundreds of people, she was the only one who no longer knew what rest was. Perhaps she believed that as long as she stood, time wouldn't dare move forward. Perhaps standing was her last way to hold on to the crown, even if only for a few more hours. No one knew what she was thinking. No one knew if she could still think at all. But everyone in that room understood. They were witnessing something that had never happened before. A queen who refused to rest, refused to fall, refused to vanish. Even when every sign showed she was utterly exhausted. Some thought it was pride. Others saw it as loneliness at a level beyond words. And as always, that loneliness was hidden beneath the hem of a long black gown. Not a single word was spoken. No one was allowed to ask how she felt, because this was the queen, and the queen was not allowed to be weak, even when facing the very end of life. That's why Elizabeth said almost nothing for many days in a row. A lady-in-waiting tried whispering into her ear, hoping for a response. But all they heard was a faint, broken breath. It wasn't that her will was gone. Her body simply no longer allowed words to come out as they once did. For years, Elizabeth ruled with intelligence and words. Now both faded like smoke. She had once silenced an entire parliament with a single sentence. Now, she couldn't even hear her own voice. One doctor suspected her mouth had begun to decay due to metal compounds in her makeup sinking too deep. The attendants noticed something had changed. Every time she tried to move her lips, no sound came out. The closest person to her saw. Her tongue had darkened, as if blood no longer flowed properly. Her teeth, already weak, had become loose and visibly discolored. Her smile, once a political weapon, was no longer an expression, but a painful memory. Some believed Elizabeth suffered from a long-standing mouth infection, but no one dared to treat it. There were no antibiotics, no anesthetics, and no one would dare suggest pulling the queen's teeth. Even a mild fever could turn fatal, especially in a body already worn out. But that exhaustion didn't come overnight. It built up through years of enduring, maintaining image, and living under absolute pressure. An old maid who had served her since youth recalled, "I've never seen her this weak, yet I've also never seen her let it show." And that was the tragedy. Elizabeth wouldn't let anyone see her pain, even when it had reached the bone. Someone tried offering her warm honey water, but she wouldn't open her mouth. Another gently placed a hand on her shoulder, hoping for a confirming glance. There was no response, no rejection, no agreement. She simply stood there, mouth closed, gaze scattered, and all that was once speech, now gone. A young servant whispered, "If this is a performance, she's the only one who knows when to drop the curtain." But the performance dragged on, and the audience began to worry they might not last until the end. No one spoke for her. No one had the authority to say what the entire nation was waiting to hear. And so they waited, in silence, waiting until the final word that no one heard no longer had a chance to exist. In the diary of a courtier, a line was written, "We were forbidden from saying the end, but silence spoke for us." No one recorded Elizabeth's last words, because perhaps there were none. Greatness doesn't always die to applause. Sometimes it vanishes in a room no one dares breathe loudly in. And so, words, the very thing that once empowered her, were the first to abandon her. The last doctor left the room without saying a word, leaving only a simple note, no longer responsive. It wasn't a diagnosis. It was the coldest truth of old medicine. Sometimes doing nothing is still a decision. The remaining attendants kept their watch. No one knew if it was to protect her or to keep her from leaving one final time. The room remained unchanged, curtains drawn, candles still burning, and the woman who once made all of Europe bow could no longer utter a single word. That silence wasn't merely an ending. It was the entire final chapter written in blank space. Some rulers die in war. Others pass amidst trumpets and flags. But Elizabeth, she chose to stand still, without speaking, without tears, without complaint. That ending, so quiet it would be disrespectful to try making it louder than it truly was. And in the dim candlelight, an era came to a close, not with bells, but with a mouth fully sealed shut. No farewell was needed, no rushed funeral, only a woman standing, then quietly walking into the next world. The greatest issue wasn't that she had died. It was that no one dared say it first. She still stood, body leaning slightly, eyes half open, hands hanging loosely. But there was no movement, no breath flickering through the candlelight. A guard whispered, "If she's alive, why is she so cold?" Another replied, "If she's dead, how is she still standing?" No one stepped forward to check. No one wanted to be the first to touch the queen, even just to be sure. A doctor was summoned. He peered through the door crack, then stepped back, his face pale. He simply said, "I'm not authorized to make a diagnosis without orders from the council." And so the entire court watched. No one left the room, but no one approached either. A motionless figure stood at the center of an empire, freezing everyone's thoughts. The candles burned to their ends, wax dripping to the floor like signs of what no one dared say aloud. A maid sobbed silently, but no one comforted her, because everyone was staring in the same direction. Seconds stretched into minutes, minutes into hours. No one knew exactly when it started or when it might end. Some began to breathe heavily, others clenched their robes tightly just to stay grounded. Then, a faint sound, a soft rustle of fabric, but no one could tell where it came from. All eyes turned to Elizabeth. No change, no reaction. That was when everyone understood. This was no longer a living person, but not yet someone gone. A liminal space freezing the room in suspended time. No one spoke, no one moved, and in that moment, perhaps everyone thought the same thing. If she's still here, what are we supposed to do? A young soldier trembled and slowly backed toward the door, as if fearing the hovering truth might cling to him. An old advisor murmured something in Latin, sounding like a plea for peace. No one scolded him, for no one knew what else to do. The bravest lady-in-waiting placed her hand on her chest, not on the queen's, but on her own, just to check that she was still alive. A strange moment when the living began to question their own reality, because one person had stood too long in silence. At last, a voice broke the stillness, softly, slowly. "Perhaps it's time." But no one replied, no one reacted, no one moved, and so they all stood a little longer, not because they didn't know what had happened, but because no one wanted to bear the weight of ending an era. She still stood, and until someone officially declared otherwise, she was still the queen. After everything settled, people began to ask questions, not about how she lived, but why she died the way she did. Medical scholars in later centuries tried to reanalyze the symptoms. Exhaustion, silence, loss of reflex, and standing motionless for days. Some suggested an infectious disease, but if that were true, why didn't anyone else in the palace get sick? Others leaned toward a cardiac cause, but no one ever checked her pulse in those final moments. A common theory is heavy metal poisoning, mercury, lead, and compounds in her cosmetics. Modern doctors agree that with prolonged use and unregulated doses, that could very well be the cause. But one theory still unsettles many, that her death might not have been natural. No one dared say poisoned, but everyone knew the court had no shortage of people eager to see the throne vacant. Elizabeth never married. No children, no official heir declared while she was still conscious. And in that very vacuum, ambition spread like fog through the palace. Many of her closest advisors had quietly reached out to potential successors, even while she was still alive. James VI of Scotland, a distant relative, began to appear in private discussions. Those who had once sworn loyalty to Elizabeth were now calculating their places in the next court. And the striking thing was, everyone knew her health was declining, but no one stepped in to stop it. They didn't harm her, but they didn't save her either. No one brought better medicine. No one insisted she rest. No one dared go against her will to preserve her life. Because if she lived just a few months longer, many plans would be delayed. Many promotions wouldn't happen. In a palace full of power, sometimes the quickest way up is to wait for the one above to disappear. A clerk wrote in his diary, "No one said it aloud, but I had the feeling they were letting her go." A young physician once asked, "Why don't we at least try to save her one more time?" But no one replied, because the real answer was too hard to say and too easy to be blamed for. Even before the funeral was held, many had already switched the emblems on their coats. The first letter sent to Scotland was signed before her death was officially announced. Queen Elizabeth wasn't murdered, but she also wasn't kept alive. And in that fragile in-between, many had already found new places for themselves. One courtier whispered, "She left as she lived, needing no one, relying on no one." But another countered, "Not needing, or simply having no one left." In the royal quarters, rumors spread faster than orders from the council. Some said Elizabeth chose that moment, so no one else could control her fate. Others believed that moment wasn't hers to choose. It belonged to those standing right outside her closed doors. No matter the truth, the death of Elizabeth I wasn't just the end of a person. It was the beginning of a new era. With every knock on a door, someone new rose. With every farewell, a whisper of power was exchanged. And while the nation wore black, the victors were already choosing new colors to wear. The throne hadn't even cooled, but the game had begun long before. Some asked, if Elizabeth had lived just one more week, would England have taken a different path? But others smiled. She didn't need more time, just less loneliness. That line never appeared in any history book, but it was passed down, quietly, softly, heavier than any funeral bell. And like every political legend, the truth didn't lie in how she died, but in who benefited from her death. That answer was never written in official records. It lived in glances, and in the silent consensus of an entire court. And in that final candlelight, a dynasty ended with the absence of loyalty. 4 years, Elizabeth wasn't just a ruler. She was a symbol, her face on coins, her portrait in every major building. Her name was a declaration. Her voice was policy. Her gaze could determine the fate of a nation. She never married, had no children, shared no power with any man, and thus the court crafted the image of the Virgin Queen like a living goddess. But every myth has its weakness, and for Elizabeth that weakness was time. As age crept in, the symbol began to crack. She no longer appeared in public, no longer gave speeches, no longer felt immortal. Her final portraits were all retouched. Whiter skin, brighter eyes, steadier hands. One court painter once confessed, "I didn't paint the queen, I painted the memory of her." In the royal chambers, they whispered, "The legend isn't here anymore. Only the person inside it remains." That person, growing weaker, drying out, fading slowly inside the very gown she once used to command the world. A gown that once represented power now felt like chains. A layer of powder that once terrified Europe was now only masking the final signs of decay. But what many struggled to accept was not her weakness, but the fact that she let it show. For the first time in nearly half a century, Elizabeth no longer controlled her own image. No more corrections, no more edits, no one close enough to erase the signs of reality. And like every statue worn by wind and rain, the mask finally fell. Behind it was no miracle, no divinity, just a tired, aging, and lonely woman. Those who once praised her now said little. Those who once feared her no longer stood tall. One courtier admitted, "I used to think she was invincible, but in the end, she was simply the last to fall." Those who once kept a respectful distance now kept it out of fear of responsibility. And Elizabeth, the woman who once defined an entire century, now stood in the palace like a forgotten shadow. A servant said, "I looked at her and didn't know whether to call her queen or someone in need of help." In cabinet meetings, the title "the Queen" gradually became just "she." People began adjusting to the next era, even though the current one hadn't officially ended. Respect didn't vanish with an insult, it vanished with silence. No one spoke ill of her, they just stopped speaking of her at all. And that's how a symbol dies in the real world. Not because it lost power, but because those around it no longer needed what it represented. They needed a transition, a successor, something else. And Elizabeth, with all her greatness, became the final obstacle to the very nation she once lifted up. In her final days, no one wanted to face her, because to face her was to face the end. An old maid said, "I couldn't look into her eyes, because in them, I saw disappointment." No one knew who she was disappointed in, herself or those waiting for her to go. Perhaps both. Perhaps everyone. Perhaps no one mattered anymore. In the end, that symbol didn't break from outside pressure. It crumbled from not being sincerely upheld. Elizabeth didn't lose the throne because of a coup. She lost it because no one lifted it for her anymore. And when the mask finally fell, they didn't see a goddess. They saw a vacant stare. That stare wasn't sad, wasn't angry, simply left the game. And in that moment, England realized the symbol had fallen. The person still stood, but the era was over. As soon as her death was confirmed, or rather no longer denied, men began returning to the palace. For days before, they had kept their distance out of respect, but really out of strategy. They didn't enter to mourn. They came to calculate. Each wore an expression not too sad, not too relieved, just enough to avoid suspicion. A private meeting was held that very afternoon, while her body had yet to be moved. They didn't call it funeral preparations. They called it planning for stable transition. No one mentioned her name. No one said, "The Queen has passed." They used the phrase, "The current situation requires swift action." Some whispered about the will. Others debated locking the royal study. Every person present had once bowed to her. Now they bowed only to the moment. One of them muttered, "We must maintain appearances, at least until the funeral." Another replied, "And afterward, any appearance will do." They discussed succession, but the big decisions had already been made. A letter to Scotland had been sealed that morning, and everyone knew it. The public announcement was delayed until the next morning. not out of respect, but to prepare the official speech. In the meantime, a group began logging everything: who entered, who stood where, who held the study key. Not to record history, but to make sure no one could accuse anyone later. The death of a queen is sensitive, but the death of a dynasty is an opportunity. They checked the seal box, financial records, and unsigned documents. Some papers were quietly taken. No one asked, no one stopped them. And in the middle of it all, Elizabeth still stood, or lay, or had already been moved. No one remembered for sure, because by then all attention had shifted from the person to the power. In England's history, rarely has someone who just died been forgotten so quickly. One of her former advisors, on his way out, paused for a second, looking at the seat where she used to hold court. He said nothing, gave no bow, just turned away. And so, the Elizabethan era ended, not with a proclamation, but with the sound of footsteps leaving the room where power once lived. The gentlemen resumed their work: meetings, letters, orders, currency printing. No one asked where she would be buried. No one needed that answer immediately, because the more important question had already been answered: who's next? And once that answer was clear, everything else was just ceremony. Elizabeth left no heir, and that was no accident. She once declared, "I am married to England." That quote was once printed with pride, etched into books, engraved on walls. But when she died, the nation realized, a marriage without children leaves behind many voids. No one was clearly designated. No one was publicly endorsed by Elizabeth while she was alive. The council tried to hide their confusion, but internal records showed they had debated the next in line for years. Many candidates were considered. Most were distant relatives or former political rivals. James VI of Scotland emerged as the safest option, not because he was loved, but because few choices remained. Elizabeth's decision not to marry was once hailed as proof of her independence. But after her death, it became evidence of a dynasty without a successor. Historians call it the silent succession crisis. No civil war, no power grabs, but also no clear sense of what to do next. A nobleman whispered over dinner, "If she had a son, things would have been simpler." Another replied, "And if she had a daughter, would the court have accepted her?" And so all speculation ended with a silent nod, because no one can rewrite the past. Some said Elizabeth was too stubborn. Others believed she deliberately left no successor to retain control of her legacy. Some even thought she trusted no one strong enough to carry it on, or that no one was worthy. But regardless of reason, the fact remained. The next morning, England woke up without a legitimate head of state. Foreign envoys sent letters asking for clarity. No one dared respond directly. Newspapers hesitated to print the news. Clergy waited for official word from the palace. And meanwhile, political factions began to move. Subtly, skillfully, and without delay. A dynasty had ended, and everyone wanted a seat at the beginning of the next. Those who once praised Elizabeth were now reading speeches welcoming the new king. No one betrayed her. They just adapted very quickly. And England, the land once ruled by a formidable woman, now placed its hopes in a man who had never lived in London. Some commoners were worried, others hopeful for change. But all could sense this. When Elizabeth died, a part of the nation's identity died with her. She had once been the constant in a chaotic world. Now that world had lost its axis, and no one was sure if the new one would spin true. A preacher said in his sermon, "God took her, but gave her no one to leave behind." That line was quoted for years, not because it was poetic, but because it hurt with truth. Elizabeth's legacy wasn't a successor, but a string of unanswered questions. Questions about womanhood, about leadership, about the loneliness of holding absolute power for nearly 50 years. Some said she sacrificed personal happiness for an ideal, but others shrugged. Or maybe she simply didn't trust anyone enough to share the throne. The truth probably lies somewhere in between. Like her image. Not fully pitiful, but not entirely admirable either. Elizabeth was a complex person, and death didn't make things any clearer. On the contrary, it revealed this: the price of a great reign is the emptiness it leaves behind. A nation lost its guide. A throne had no one ready to sit upon it. And all that remained was her name, carved in cold stone, but never quite carved into any heart completely. When the council officially confirmed the queen's death, the next step wasn't burial. It was performance. The first thing they did wasn't pray, they called for a makeup artist. She hadn't moved in 3 days. And now, everything needed to be adjusted to look royal. The maids, dressed in black, with trembling hands and empty eyes, looked as if they were preparing a mannequin, not a woman. They cleansed her face with rosewater, added another layer of white powder, just like every time Elizabeth prepared to appear. But this time, she no longer looked in the mirror. One maid whispered beside her, "We must make her as beautiful as she was in life." But everyone knew this was just a shell. Her eyes were closed by hand, her mouth gently fixed shut so it wouldn't open during the viewing. The wig was adjusted, the crown placed atop her head as if it had never left. Soft fabric was stuffed into her sleeves to prevent her arms from folding unnaturally in the coffin. Someone carefully draped velvet around her neck to hide the hollows beginning to show. Everything was done in silence. No farewells, no weeping, just repeated motions. The room resembled a backstage more than a place of mourning, because the goal wasn't to say goodbye, but to ensure that in her final appearance, she was still the queen. An advisor requested more candles, not to pray, but to ensure good lighting for the portrait. The public would be allowed one last viewing, but only from a distance, no touching. A doctor sighed, "If only we cared for her like this when she was alive, perhaps things would be different." No one responded. No one made eye contact. Everyone was busy preserving ceremonial silence. A young man mounted a portrait of her youth behind the coffin, so mourners would see that instead of reality. They recreated her image with light, powder, silk, and selective forgetting. And finally, Elizabeth appeared once more, not as a person, but as the most beautiful version of a memory. People lined up, bowed their heads, unsure who they were really mourning. A person, a monarch, or an image designed to calm the nation. Some said she looked like she was sleeping. Others said, "No, she's waiting to be remembered in a less real way." For the next 3 days, every visitor was reminded, "Speak softly, don't linger, ask nothing." The coffin closed after official hours, reopened at dawn, like a museum exhibit with fixed opening times. No one knelt, no one kissed her hand. They simply passed by, looked, nodded slightly, and moved on to the New England. A dynasty was closed with a performance as precise as it was chilling. The real woman had long since left. What remained was the final makeup of history. And in that candlelight, death was less frightening than being replaced by a version more acceptable to memory. The funeral was scheduled nearly a week after her passing, long enough to prepare a ceremony, both solemn and strategic. Over 1,000 people joined the procession, from nobles, clergy, to faction representatives. The coffin was carried by a golden dragon carriage, with black cloth-covered wheels, drawn by 4 white horses. Mourning drums beat steadily, cannons fired from the Tower of London, as if celebrating one last victory. The public stood silent on both sides. No one cried, no one smiled. They came out of duty, curiosity, or simply not wanting to miss a national event. Black cloth was handed out to those not dressed properly. Emotions were not inspected. A government official read the eulogy. She was a light that never faded, but everyone knew. The candles burned out last week. The procession passed every place tied to her reign: the palace, chapel, court, watchtower. But no one mentioned the room where she died, because it didn't fit the legend. The hymns were carefully selected, not too sad, not too joyful, just enough for the cameras. A foreign journalist wrote, "I've never seen a funeral with so many people, and so little emotion." The coffin was closed, but on the lid was a wax figure of Elizabeth, her face at least 30 years younger. The figure wore a faint smile, something Elizabeth hadn't truly done in a very long time. The crowd passed by, looked at the statue, and appeared moved. as if they truly believed she had gone in peace. But those who had lived close to her knew peace was never something she had. The quietest moment of the funeral came when the drums stopped. But it was also when someone shouted, "God save the next king." No one mentioned the name Elizabeth anymore. All her emblems were taken down the moment the cannons fired. Some quietly turned away, not out of sorrow, but because they knew the old era had just been locked away by politics. She was buried at Westminster, beside her sister Mary, the same sister she had once refused to be buried next to. But history does not ask the dead for their opinion. History arranges what's convenient. Churches across the nation held prayers simultaneously, as a way to synchronize emotion. But everyone knew, emotion isn't synchronized. It's choreographed to appear that way. An old monk muttered, "I don't feel her soul here, only the echo of what power once was." On the way home, the crowd began talking about the new king. Some even debated whether James would reform the church laws or rule with the same long, quiet grip as his predecessor. No one asked what happened in her room during those final days. No one wanted to know. A young priest said, "If we make the funeral big enough, people won't ask too many questions." And that's exactly what happened. Cannons, drums, music, wax statue, readings, loud enough to fill the public's void. But to the few who truly loved her, the funeral wasn't a tribute. It was a formal way to legalize her replacement. A servant stood far in the back, not invited, and said one thing, "That's not her." And someone beside him sighed, "But that's what people want to see." The truth, as always, had no place in the ceremony. Only the ritual necessity did. A funeral isn't to say goodbye. It's to declare, the old reign is over. A few weeks later, preparations for James's coronation began, and people started calling Elizabeth the former monarch. Her period was rewritten as a comma in a new sentence. Flags with her image were rolled up and stored. No one knew when they'd be needed again. But for many, Elizabeth's funeral wasn't an ending. It was the day they were forced to accept that what was once great was no longer guarded. And no matter how many drums, cannons, or kind words were spoken, no one could replace the presence that once made a nation fall silent. The dead can be canonized in speech, but only the living decide if they're remembered. In this case, the living chose to move on, without looking back. The funeral ended with a choir, but the loudest sound was the footsteps of important men walking away. No one lingered too long. No one looked back one last time. A century ended not with a sob, but with a checklist of things to change in the next reign. Elizabeth was once the center. Now she was a footnote in a lesson easily skipped if no one asked. The funeral didn't make people remember her more. It just helped them move on faster. And beneath the firework farewell, perhaps she understood that too. Silent in life, painted in death, and finished with drums that weren't meant just for her. It wasn't just a funeral. It was a lesson on how power ends while everyone's still pretending. The day Elizabeth was buried was also the day James was officially called King of England. There was no time for prolonged remembrance. History had already turned the page. James came from Scotland, bringing a new accent, a new advisory board, and a smile just reassuring enough. He didn't need to do much. The exhaustion from the old reign had already prepared the loyalty for the new one. Advisors quickly retranslated their titles into the language of the new court. Your Majesty didn't change, but the direction of the gaze did. In the first meetings, no one mentioned Elizabeth. Not out of contempt, but because her presence no longer served a political purpose. James didn't criticize his predecessor. He simply carried on, as if everything had always belonged to him. He took the throne, handed out titles, reshuffled roles, just to freshen the air. And the strange thing was, no one objected. Parliament held a formal reception, with solemn faces, but beneath them was a sigh few would admit. An old official whispered, "At last, someone who makes decisions without standing still for 3 days." England, after nearly half a century under a woman who never stepped back, now felt relieved to be led by someone who could smile at the right time. James didn't have fire in his eyes, no grand declarations, But he had something Elizabeth had long lost: freshness. And sometimes, freshness is enough. In the first few weeks, he toured the realm, shook hands, gave soft orders, and earned trust simply by being normal. No demands for oaths, no extravagant festivals. Yet the people felt reassured. A blacksmith wrote in his journal, "The new king has strong teeth. Good. He'll reign long." That remark was simple, but deeper than any speech ever given at a coronation. Meanwhile, Elizabeth's statue remained in storage, with no date for display. No one erased her name from history books. They just stopped adding new chapters. Schools still taught her era as a golden age, but no one asked students how they felt about her. Her portraits were replaced by James's, younger, fresher, more direct in gaze. The transition was so gentle. No one noticed. They just said goodbye to a generation. A dynasty doesn't vanish by crumbling, but by being replaced, detail by detail. Elizabeth was once the symbol of England. Now, the new symbol was stability, regardless of whose face it wore. And James, with one morning smile, became the first in nearly 50 years to let the court breathe easy. It's said that in his first meeting, James smiled and asked, "Is there anything urgent?" No one answered. They were getting used to being asked. In that calm, no one mentioned the one who had gone. But everyone knew Elizabeth would not return. No memorials were built. No proposals for a national mourning day the following year. Only one thing remained: her shadow, long, cold, stretching through the palace halls. James didn't try to erase that shadow. He just walked through it as if it wasn't there. And perhaps that was what Elizabeth feared most. Not being overthrown, but being left behind. But the kingdom had to go on. The wheel of power does not stop to wait for grief. And so the successor came, not like a storm, but like a breeze opening the windows after a long winter. No one welcomed him with tears, but everyone was ready to listen. And in that first morning, the new king's smile became the first signal of a new era. Not glorious, not dazzling, but enough to begin. And so, for the first time in nearly 50 years, England exhaled. After nearly 500 lines telling the life and death of Elizabeth I, you might be asking, so was she happy? No one can answer that, because even while alive, she never let anyone close enough to ask. She ruled for 44.5 years. No one overthrew her. No one controlled her. But no one truly stood beside her either. In exchange for the crown came a depleted body, an isolated mind, and a death the entire court avoided looking at directly. These things aren't in textbooks. They lie between the lines of history for those who truly read. And you, sitting here, have read far enough to know. Being queen wasn't like the stories tell. There were no gowns fluttering in the wind, no lifelong romance, just a woman carrying an entire country on her shoulders, slowly fading into the silence of the throne she sat on. When Elizabeth died, no one cried out a grand farewell. No one shouted, "We lost a legend." They just changed names on documents, switched the portraits, and moved on. That's the cost of power. No one keeps it forever, and no one is mourned too long. Maybe you're thinking, I wouldn't live like that. But remember, Elizabeth didn't choose to be a symbol. She simply refused to let go when everyone else had. And in doing so, she became a queen through resilience and a loneliness few dared to touch. Her life was a lesson not meant for children or for those who think the crown means only glory. Because maybe no one truly wants to be queen when the price is your entire self. So what about you? If you had to choose, would you live as she did? Stand 3 days so you wouldn't fall in front of history? Or would you stay silent, like those who walked past her, never looking back? Whatever your answer, you've made it to the end of this story. And if this journey was worth it, don't forget to leave a word, a follow, for those history almost forgot. Hello there. Thank you for taking a few minutes to stop by. I hope your day has been peaceful, or at least calm enough to enjoy a good story. Tonight, we're diving into the life of Catherine the Great, a German princess who somehow became Russia's Iron Queen, not thanks to magic, nor because she was favored, But because she chose not to accept the fate handed to her, Catherine was sent to a foreign land, changed her name, her religion, and married a man with, let's say, rather strange interests. But instead of sinking, she learned to observe, stay silent, and quietly plan to change everything, patiently, but fiercely. This story has love, betrayal, ideals, reforms, and decisions that made all of Europe step back. And perhaps you might see a bit of yourself in her journey, especially when you're faced with the choice: accept or change. If the storytelling style speaks to you, feel free to subscribe, so you won't have to dig around later just to find that one spiky queen. But if you're not sure yet, just keep listening. The story is yours, told the way you want to feel it. By the way, where are you watching from? And what time is it there? I'm recording this around midnight. Stories like this, when heard late at night, tend to linger, especially when the main character is hard to forget. Now imagine this: you're 14, living in Germany, when suddenly you're shipped off to Russia, where you know no one and can't speak a word. No one asks if you're ready. There's only a summons, a carriage, and a new title with responsibilities no one prepares you for. Catherine wasn't born to be a queen, but she lived like she always was. She learned Russian so well she spoke it better than her husband. She read philosophy in silence, wrote journals at night, and analyzed every glance in court. When her moment came, she didn't hesitate. She rode to the army camp and said clearly, "I am the ruler of Russia." No one stopped her, because she didn't wait for approval. She created agreement. So how did a teenage girl claim the throne and keep it for 34 years? Was she a pioneer of enlightenment or just a master of power? To answer that, we need to start with the simplest things: a strange bed, a freezing morning, and the feeling of being lost inside a palace. Your first bed has no lace canopy, no soft pillows, and definitely no heating. It's an old wooden plank, harder than your stepmother's greetings, covered by a musty wool blanket. The smell? Like soaking socks in the rain for 3 days and airing them out in a wine cellar. The pillow is stuffed with straw, not clean straw, sometimes with rat fur and bits of sand. Every night, you sleep to the sound of wind whistling through cracks, cold enough that you bury your head into the pillow, like you're trying to escape the world. But the world doesn't let you escape, because just as you begin to dream, the bedbugs start their party. They don't bite to live. They bite to remind you you're still in Zerst. Some nights, you feel like you've caught smallpox from the bites. On better nights, getting 1 hour of sleep is a victory. You curl up, trying to trap warmth under the stiff fabric, while your knee touches the cold edge of the bed like a blade. They call it a princess bed, but it feels like being held in a stone cellar. The ceiling is so low you might bump your head if you sit up too fast. The walls crack, exhaling cold, damp air. At night, mice run like soldiers in drills, and wind slices through your nightgown like razors. You wake up before anyone else, not because you're diligent, but because you never really slept. Your body aches, your thighs are numb from the cold, your fingers stiff like dead twigs. You hear footsteps outside, heavy, hurried, like someone trying to outrun their own thoughts. A servant quietly opens the door, bringing a washcloth soaked in water, cold as well water can get. You bend down, splash your face. Clarity doesn't come fast, but the sting hits your forehead like a slap. Your eyes glance at a small bronze mirror, warped, cracked at the edges, reflecting a child about to become an adult. Hair tangled from wool blankets, skin dry from mist, lips cracked from wind. But the eyes are lighting up with something else. You no longer cry, because here, crying just makes your face heavier. And tears aren't any warmer than the blankets. You step out of the room in a thick dress, stiff like armor made from old tablecloths. Every step echoes with fabric rubbing, not the sound of power, but of survival. You see servants passing by, and none of them smile. They also sleep in musty blankets and share bedbugs with the nobles. There's no perfume in the air, only the scent of wilted radish, unwashed fur coats, and half-burned firewood. Outside, winter claws at the doors with icy fingernails. But you still have to attend morning meetings like a true royal. The maid adjusts your coat, and her hands are as cold as kitchen stones. No one has time to warm up. You think of last night's bed, the restless sleep, and wonder, is this a beginning or a punishment? A princess should have an embroidery room, golden curtains, and soft music in the morning. But here, you only get drafty tiles and a few bedbugs that still aren't full. There is no pleasant morning in Zerst, just mornings without illness, and that alone is a blessing. You wipe your own face, tie your hair with an old thread, and stand in front of the mirror once more. Not to admire, but to remind yourself, today you won't fall. Your eyes stare straight, no more trembling, though your fingers are still purple from the cold, and your stomach empty since yesterday. You know you have to go out, sit at the table, smile on cue, speak just enough, and remember everything. There's no one whispering, "You've got this," but you still rise, simply because there's no other choice. Outside, the sun hasn't risen, but in your mind, calculations have already begun to warm you up. One more day will pass, and you'll survive. Not by magic, but by memory and sheer will. The room is cold, but inside you, something has just sparked. Small but real. It's not hope, it's intention. The intention not to stay in Zerst forever, because that bed was never meant for a queen. Even if for now you must sleep in it for a few more winters. If you imagine Russian palaces with marble bathrooms and flowing hot water, well, sorry to disappoint. The first bathroom Catherine entered had rough stone walls and water dripping from the ceiling like quiet sobs. The smell? Hard to describe. Half cold ash, half like unwashed diapers from last month. On the floor, a dented brass basin lay waiting to be stepped on. No toilet, just an old wooden bench where everything happened in silence and cold drafts. The wind in a Russian bathroom doesn't just chill. It scratches at your neck like the nails of a strict German nanny. Catherine sat there, feeling, for the first time, a shiver of dread under the Empire's flag. Every sound echoed like a cannon blast. The stone walls didn't hold warmth, but they held noise perfectly. Privacy, that concept doesn't exist here. Only the habit of being overheard through walls remains. A servant waits outside, barely breathing, but you know they hear everything. In Russia, manners mean pretending to be deaf. Catherine quickly realized, to survive here, you must learn Russian before toilet paper, because there was no paper. Really, the closest substitute was a few dull gray cloth scraps, washed and reused. They weren't soft. And once, Catherine found one embroidered with Elizabeth, perhaps from the former Empress. Every bathroom trip was a test of both physiology and ethics. Silence was hard. Keeping your faith was harder. The hand-washing water sat in a stone basin by the door, so cold it could turn a boiled egg back into a raw one. Every morning, Catherine had to wash her face there. The water numbed her skin, but at least it distracted from her cracked lips. The mirror on the wall was brass dark, warped, but perfectly reflected the fatigue of whoever stood before it. Every toilet trip was a psychological exam. No trembling hands, no noise, and don't ask why everyone coughs softly when you exit. Catherine learned to identify people by the scent their bathroom left behind. That's why she held her breath walking past the lower hall. The guest lavatories were more private, but the water was still cold, and the bedbugs still picked the worst time to strike. Some days, Catherine sat silently on the wooden seat, reading new Russian words carved into the wall. Maybe a soldier did it, or someone once hopeless. Invisibility is a skill, she remembered that one, while scratching the damp cloth on her knee from yesterday's wash. Each day she spoke Russian a little better, and each day she let go of her old idea of privacy a little more. She learned when the bathroom was cleaned, usually too late, and also learned, never use the third towel from the left. A new habit formed. Take a deep breath before entering, then hold it for exactly 48 seconds. No more, no less. At first, she smiled at servants when leaving the bathroom. After a week, just a nod. After a month, direct eye contact. She never complained, but she recorded. In her mind, in her notes, in her eyes, because even mold can become a weapon. Russians say cold builds character. Catherine thought, cold just makes you miss your mom's wooden toilet seat. She figured if she could survive winter bathrooms in Russia, the throne might not be that far off. Though each time she bent to wash her hands, she shivered. Not sure if it was water or century-old tears. Privacy didn't exist here. She got used to it like people get used to ticking clocks. Annoying, then silence. One night, she used the bathroom at midnight. No lights, no sound, just moonlight slicing through the window frame. She saw her shadow on the wall, small, trembling, but upright, and knew that shadow wasn't fading soon. From that night on, she wasn't afraid of the bathroom. She was afraid she might get used to it, because once you accept the smell, the chill, and the stares, you're one step closer to the crown. Not through a coronation, but through surviving every filthy towel and whispered judgment. Catherine learned Russian, but even more, she learned how to walk like she belonged, even walking out of there. And funny enough, after a few weeks, she was the one teaching the maids how to make towels stay clean longer. Not out of love, out of certainty. This place would be hers, soon enough. But before changing the empire, she had to survive breakfast. And breakfast here didn't smell much better. Her first breakfast at the Russian palace was called a ritual, but it felt like a chewing contest. Catherine entered the dining room with dozens of nobles, everyone in fur, yet somehow no one smelled good. The table was long, tablecloth folded neatly, candles flickering like old paintings, but the smell, like fermented porridge. First course, kasha, buckwheat porridge boiled in bone broth, meaning water that once saw bones pass through. It was thick as hand-mixed cement, clinging to the spoon like it begged her not to eat it. Catherine tried, but each bite echoed like plaster scraping against stone. With it came black bread, good enough to hammer nails if you had no tools. No need to toast it, it was tough enough to outlive winter. And Russian noble opinions. Butter? None. Cheese? Also no. Just congealed fat. Looked like candle wax gone bad. The drink was weak beer, but warm. Not cold enough to be tasty, not hot enough to make sense. She looked around, everyone eating like it was a reward. Maybe they knew strange reactions got noticed here. She faked slow chewing. In her head, comparing it to the cheap oatmeal from Germany, the one she now missed. Back home, at least she ate in silence. Here, every spoon hitting a plate was part of an unwilling orchestra. The smell of porridge mixed with half-dried fur coats, neighboring body odor, and the suspicion in a noble's stare. An old nobleman on her left offered her some meat jelly. Looked like jelly, smelled like a janitor's rag. Catherine nodded, smiled slightly, then cut a piece. The jelly wobbled like it disagreed. The meat didn't melt in her mouth. It just sat there. A reminder, welcome to Russia. She grabbed the beer glass, hoping to rinse the aftertaste. But it smelled like millet soaked in old cloth. The server stood straight, pouring like he was in a contest for stiffest arms, not royal service. Catherine glanced at her husband. He was busy stacking spoons like toy soldiers, not eating a thing. While others ate to survive, Peter seemed to eat just to play war games in his head. Catherine kept her head down, silently counting minutes. She wasn't hungry anymore. She just wanted it to end. One time, she tried hiding a piece of bread in her napkin, but it was too hard, it tore the linen. She started missing mornings in Zerbst, where at least cold porridge still smelled like rice. Here, hot porridge smelled like reused spoons. A servant brought in boiled eggs. The yolks were green, meaning they had passed the threshold of existence. Catherine stopped eating. She smiled politely, set down her napkin, and waited for someone to change the topic or for the weather to change. An old lady on her right started describing last season's smoked venison. Catherine thought it sounded like a pathology report. She developed a new skill, smiling gracefully while hearing horror stories. It would be useful later. Breakfast ended with black tea, no sugar, no milk, and no need. Catherine took a sip and stared at the cup, as if expecting an apology. None came. People say breakfast is the most important meal of the day. In Russia, it's a test of body and spirit, and you must pass. If you don't finish it, people might think "You don't like Russia." Catherine ate enough to stay alive, but not enough to believe in warmth. She left the table, stomach light not from fullness, but from relief. Relief from stomach torture. Behind her, servants cleared the plates, once white porcelain, now tinted by time and mineral water. Catherine stepped out of the dining room, feeling as if she had just passed an exam, with her teeth. She said nothing, but in her mind, she noted, "Reform the kitchen." Soon, the palace was grand, but after a breakfast like that, the warmest place was the hallway air. And when Catherine saw a servant bring out a wash basin for hand cleaning, she simply nodded. At that point, anything seemed edible. At least breakfast taught her one thing. Not everything royal is worth envying, especially the spoon. Catherine once thought a princess gown would feel like clouds and smell like cinnamon. In reality, each formal dress in Russia was stiff like armor and smelled like old blankets stored in a wine cellar. Dresses required assistance. If you dressed yourself, you'd be shaped like a moving mushroom. The first corset she wore squeezed her so tight, Catherine felt like she was being prayed for. Aggressively. One day, she fainted during tea, not from emotion, but from lack of oxygen. And that was normal here. If you didn't faint in formal wear, you weren't royal enough. Peter, her husband, chose to wear military uniform, even to bed. "To look cool," he said, before climbing into bed with his belt and jingling medals. Catherine spent over 30 minutes undressing, 15 more to remove the wig, and 10 minutes to search for lice. Yes, they were always there, on collars, in lace, under hats, and especially fond of velvet lining. Once, she scratched until bleeding, thinking it was an allergy, until she saw a louse dancing on her hand. Servants suggested herbal perfume water, but it only made the lice happier. Catherine began to suspect that every Russian noble had a personal insect collection. Clothes weren't washed often, because body odor is royal identity. She once tried sneaking some items to be washed. Result: scolded for removing the spirit of the outfit. The thick wool socks she thought would warm her turned out to be excellent scent retainers. She once smelled memories of a cold day last year from those socks. Her shoes were stiff as wood. 10 minutes in them and you'd know exactly how many bones are in your foot. So Catherine learned to walk slowly, not for elegance, but to keep her toenails. Hair wasn't washed, only combed with a bone brush, the lice's favorite place, right after collars. One time she accidentally said "so itchy" during a meeting. People thought she was talking about politics. Every night, Catherine had to choose. Sleep with a thick fur hat, hot as an oven, or without it and freeze like ice. She chose the hat, then got up at 3 a.m. to pick lice out of the fur trim. One time, she saw Peter counting lice on his coat, like they were medals of honor. "They're more loyal than my soldiers," he laughed. Catherine didn't know whether to nod or run. Royal gowns were so heavy they needed their own chairs. Otherwise, you'd topple like a paper boat. Catherine once nearly fell into the fireplace when her gown wrapped around her leg. Luckily, only the hem caught fire. Since then, her dress always had a faint burnt smell, like the half-scorched memory of her marriage. One time, she heard a rustle inside her sleeve. Something crawled out. No one asked because everyone understood. When you live in a palace and ask yourself while changing, "Does this carry any creatures?" Then, that's when you know you've become truly Russian. And nothing proves your loyalty to the empire more than still wearing it, even when your whole body itches. Catherine grew used to lice brushing across her neck like wind. She even named a few particularly energetic ones. She tried folding her gown the German way. The maids looked at her like she'd just murdered a god. "Princesses don't fold dresses. Dresses must stand on their own," they said with religious conviction. Catherine smiled politely, but in her head, she was already planning the laundry revolution. Perhaps right after educational reform, she'd declare war on royal odors. Every time she changed, Catherine told herself, "This is the price of power." But what kind of power itches like this? If you ever thought a princess gown was a dream, Catherine would gladly give you one, and a few lice as souvenirs. And that night, like every night, She slept with a prickling sensation all over. Not from emotion, but from bugs partying. One evening, Catherine had a toothache. The kind that throbs with every heartbeat, you know that type? She thought it was just mild sensitivity, maybe from smiling too much at her in-laws. But by midnight, the pain spread to her temple. Her left eye started twitching. Each heartbeat felt like a hammer hitting her jaw. Catherine couldn't speak anymore. She asked for a doctor but was denied. Why? The former empress was still alive and hadn't approved Catherine to have her teeth checked. Yes, you heard right. In this empire, even dental checkups required permission. Servants were only allowed to call a tooth man, basically an old guy with a rusty pair of pliers. Catherine would rather endure the pain than let him touch her mouth. She tried to endure it, but by morning, she had a 39 degrees Celsius fever. Blurry vision, dry mouth. Catherine thought she was dying. Honestly, she wasn't far off. A nurse whispered to her, "Be careful. They might be drugging you." Catherine didn't know who they were, but in Russia, that warning is always valid. Could be Peter. Could be her mother-in-law. Could be the cook. Or yesterday's napkin. She began vomiting. Even with nothing left inside, she kept throwing up. The nurse gave her a kind of drink. Catherine drank it, then lost consciousness for 10 minutes. When she woke, the toothache was still there. But her mind started to wonder, was it really a toothache? Or was it a disguise for a poisoning attempt? A palace conspiracy starting from a tooth's nerve? Sounds crazy, but in Russia, nothing's too far-fetched. Catherine wrote to her mother, asking for medicine. The letter was intercepted. The old empress said, "Women must learn to endure." Catherine smiled, then cried from the pain. Peter said, "Try soaking your tooth in vodka." She tried and nearly passed out from the sting. That day, Catherine ate nothing, just sat by the window, hand on her cheek, heart full of doubt. An old servant walked by, silently placing a handkerchief with old bloodstains in her hand. That was the welcome gift to the Russian court. Everyone had lost a tooth, and some, their lives. That night, Catherine curled up in blankets, her jaw still throbbing with every heartbeat. She no longer feared toothaches. She feared teeth might not be the only things to fall out. For the first time, Catherine dreamt of Germany, where teeth were pulled by appointment. She woke to find her cheek wet, not knowing if it was tears or pus. And like every princess studying abroad, she learned her first lesson. A toothache could be political. After the fever, Catherine was summoned to court etiquette lessons. On the very day she had nothing but pond water tea. She wasn't allowed a break. No one was. In Russia, taking a break means, "Are you dead?" From early morning, she had to learn bows, curtsies, and standing still for 3 hours without itching. Try standing still with lice crawling under your dress. Then you can judge. They taught Catherine to wash her hands with snow. "This is ceremony, not hygiene," they said. At noon, she had to attend meetings, though no one asked her opinion, only that she didn't yawn. She studied Russian history, a subject with lots of blood, little logic, and no room for questions. In the afternoon, she read diplomatic letters, then got asked, why doesn't Germany love Russia more? As if she represented the entire German nation. Once, she suggested changing the way royal decrees were written, only to be told, women change scarves, not laws. One night, Catherine stayed up late reading the old constitution, only to see it thrown into the fire the next morning. Peter played with toy soldiers. She cleaned up the mess. Sounds familiar? One day, a foreign ambassador visited. Catherine had to memorize a whole French greeting. But just as she stood to speak, Peter sneezed, and the whole room laughed at her non-Russian accent. Catherine smiled faintly, then returned to her room and wrote in her flickering candlelight journal, "Today I was only allowed to exist. Every day's work was the same, only the judges changed, not the pressure. Each morning was a battle, against stares, against insinuations, and against herself. One day, she walked the hall and saw blood not fully cleaned from last night's execution. But she still had to smile, because smiling was the only weapon not yet confiscated. Catherine began drawing mental maps: who stood where, who disliked whom, who stayed silent that day. And from that, she forged her weapon: observation, something Peter never understood. Sometimes she sat in crowds, looking lost. But in truth, she was noting every nod. One day, a servant asked, "Is your Majesty well?" She nodded, though her hands shook from hunger, starving for information, starving for power, starving for a chance to do more than survive. Catherine once dreamed of riding horses like a queen. Now she rode disappointment through each day. Peter told her, "You don't need to do anything, just be pretty." She looked at him, then the mirror. There was nothing pretty in sunken eyes and dreams postponed day after day. But she didn't fall. Each time she rose from a ceremonial stumble, she gained another political lesson. Each insult for not being Russian taught her how to respond with a glance. And every time she felt useless, she reminded herself, Peter is the one digging his own grave. Catherine wasn't a fairy tale princess. She was a historian writing in her own blood, drop by drop. Her job had no salary, no breaks, no praise. But there was one thing no one could take from her: willpower. Peter ruled by title. Catherine, she learned to rule by patience. And you know what's funny? Even the floor cleaner saw that clearer than her husband did. "Anything new today?" Peter asked. Catherine smiled. "No, just learned one more thing." She didn't say what it was, but in her journal it was marked with 3 exclamation points. Her task was to live as if no one watched while watching everything. And when the time came, she wouldn't ask for permission. She would act, not as a wife, but as someone rewriting history. In the Russian court, women weren't allowed to make mistakes, but had to do everything. Catherine had no friends, only servants and watchers. Her maid slept by the door. If Catherine cried, they'd hear. If she whispered, they'd write it down. Her mother-in-law had a face colder than marble, and could smile while sentencing someone to death. Every time Catherine asked about the future, the answer was always stories of princesses being silenced. Not metaphorically, literally silenced, with mouth locks. They said women must be gentle, obedient, and grateful they weren't burned. A maid named Anna once dropped a tablecloth. The next day, Anna vanished. Children in the palace, unless princes, were just crying decorations. Catherine once saw a 4-year-old stand for 2 hours just to bow at the right moment. Bow wrong, a slap. Bow late, sleep outside in the snow. Character building, adults called it. The child just coughed until he lost his voice. Catherine once saw a girl with a swollen face still forced to teach etiquette to the prince. In the palace, women weren't allowed to be sick. If tired, they had to faint gracefully. Catherine tried once, collapsed during a banquet. Result? Scolded for spilling wine on a noble's dress. Women had rights. The right to be silent, the right to starve, and the right to be blamed when the king sneezed. When Catherine asked, "What if I'm wrong?" a housekeeper replied, "Being wrong is a woman's nature." Peter played with toy soldiers. Girls in the palace were trained to serve Peter when they grew up. A 6-year-old once whispered, "I want to learn to read," and was taken away to learn how to pour tea. Catherine began hiding books in her dress. She taught girls to read at noon in the storage room. They whispered each word like reciting a prayer. One day, her mother-in-law found out. Catherine was banned from speaking to the girls for corrupting noble character. Noble character, according to them, meant knowing how to obey, stay silent, and be a man's backdrop. Older women learned to hold their breath, literally, when passing guards in the hallway, because someone was once dragged away just for breathing too annoyingly. In the palace, women were flowers, but flowers plucked petal by petal, day by day. Catherine knew that to survive, she had to become a flower with thorns. But first, she had to learn to smile while knowing someone was watching her from behind the curtain. One night, she looked in the mirror and asked herself, "Who am I without hope?" The answer was a walking shadow, but Catherine refused to live like a shadow. She remembered every word from the women around her. The words swallowed, the dimmed eyes. She didn't cry, she wrote. In her journal, she wrote, "If I ever rule, No girl will have to serve tea while running a fever. If, a small word, holding thousands of silenced voices. Catherine wasn't born a queen, but she was born a witness. She remembered every woman who had been forced into silence. She remembered every child who learned to bow before they learned to speak. And she remembered this: if you want to change something, you can't keep bowing forever. She lifted her head, not because she was allowed to, but because she couldn't take it anymore. In the Russian palace, if you weren't royalty, you cleaned what royalty left behind. Catherine once thought royal baker sounded nice, until she saw dough kneaded by foot. That baker had lost 2 toes. Not from the oven, but from frostbite, necrosis, and snapping like twigs. Another noble job: scenting the royal clothes. Sounds romantic, right? It meant standing in a sealed warehouse full of cheap perfume. No wind, no windows, and no sense of smell after 3 months. People in that job called themselves the breathless ones. In the kitchens, someone tasted food not to check flavor, but to test for poison. If you survive, I'll eat, Peter once told the chef. If not, then they'd just swap in someone new. One man's job was to polish the queen's shoes with his tongue. No joke. It was a real tradition. Catherine heard of it and ordered it banned. But the stench haunted the hallway for a week. Shoemakers for the army had hands full of metal shards, eyes swollen from smoke. But it was still considered lucky work, since they weren't beaten. The man who made hats for Peter had to measure every strand of hair, then got punished for unroyal stitching. Another job: wiping sweat from the guards' faces while they stood still in snowstorms. Not a joke. Every 30 minutes, someone had to wipe them to stop them from collapsing. The guards stood like statues. The wipers shook like reeds. Another tough job: changing the veils over statues of old tsars whenever foreign guests visited. You had to climb high, never show your face, and if you got tangled, you'd fall with the old regime. Catherine once saw a woman 7 months pregnant still doing that job. Why? Because she's the only one not afraid of heights. In the palace, you could be a royal embroiderer, yet still live in a damp basement. Embroidery required sharp eyes, steady hands, and a mind calm enough to ignore the screaming above. A girl named Irina once said, "Each stitch is a day I don't go mad." Catherine gave her an oil lamp. She cried like she'd never seen light before, because in the palace, light was luxury, madness was free. Every palace job sounded royal until you actually did it. Catherine wrote, "This isn't an empire. It's a sweatshop with a king as the factory boss, and everyone in it was a gear, screeching quietly until it snapped." Peter didn't know their names. Catherine remembered them all, because one day, she'd need to know who was still alive, and who wasn't, when the tide turned. When Catherine first arrived in Russia, it felt like winter was testing how long she could last. You think a palace has fireplaces? It does, but just enough to keep the nobleman's cats warm. Her bedroom felt like a meat locker, unless you measured temperature by how your breath froze mid-curse. The blankets were thick, but stiff as doormats, and smelled like an unwashed artillery coat. Catherine once wrote, "I woke up with purple toes and a bedbug biting my ear. No one found it strange. They just said, Russian bedbugs are bigger than German ones, but more polite. By day, you wore 3 layers. By night, you wore the same because if you took them off, you might not wake up again. In winter, you learned to sleep without moving. Each turn felt like touching a frozen stone. It got so cold that the wash basin water froze while you were still looking in the mirror. Summer was different, not cold. Just smelled like a gym locker sealed for 2 years. No fans. Walls didn't breathe. Curtains trapped heat like clay pots. Catherine once fled her room because she couldn't stand the sweat smell coming from the statue in the corner. Peter wore his full military uniform even in summer because morale mattered more than sweat glands. Catherine's maid once fainted at noon, revived with a basin of water, hotter than her own body. In the palace, summer meant breeding rats, clouds of flies, and windows that only welcomed more heat. Once Catherine opened a window, hoping for breeze, only to see a soot oven and a pile of scorched geese. One day, it hit 100 degrees Fahrenheit, 38 degrees Celsius. A guard collapsed. Peter replaced him with a statue. Catherine didn't laugh. She had perfume scattered along the halls, hoping to outmatch the royal body odor. Russians were used to the weather. Catherine got used to pretending not to smell it. Winter froze her stiff. Summer melted her limp. Both lit her brain with quiet despair. In Zerst, it was bitter cold, but at least you could warm your hands by a wood stove. In St. Petersburg, you warmed your hands over politics and felt death breathe down your spine. No one taught Catherine how to stay warm, but everyone learned how to keep a calm face. You were shivering, sweating, going blind, but still had to bow when someone walked past. In the palace, even a yawn at the wrong time could be taken as disloyalty. Catherine once placed a bowl of water in front of her to act as a DIY air cooler. Result: heat stroke. The doctor said, "A noble body can't handle science." She once asked, "Why not install wind shafts?" The answer: wind is nature's, and nature doesn't belong to royalty. Catherine once dreamed of living somewhere with fans, cold towels, and iced coffee. When she woke up, there was just sweat on her pillow and a mosquito on her forehead, debating whether to bite a queen. That's how it was in the Russian palace. You didn't die of hunger, but of humidity and silent despair. Winter tested your body. Summer tortured your mind. And between those two extremes, Catherine mastered survival through indifference and observation. She didn't curse, didn't complain, just quietly wrote things down and made plans. One day, when she had power, Catherine ordered air vents and shafts to be installed. Not for comfort, but so others wouldn't suffer as she did. Because she knew an empire shouldn't stink literally or politically. In winter, you learn to endure. In summer, you learn not to scream. And in both, you learn to smile not because you're happy, but because you're still alive. So if you've got a fan on right now, thank Catherine. And don't forget to turn it off before the next part begins. In 18th century Russia, one thing was more certain than royalty or the weather: parasites. Catherine once wrote, "I'm never alone. Something always crawls across my back at night." One time, she placed her hand on her pillow and heard a soft crunch. Not fabric, but a bedbug saying hello. If you've ever been bitten by a mosquito on a Vietnamese summer night, congrats, you've scratched the surface of life in the Russian court. German lice like hair. Russian lice prefer skin. Royal lice? They crave both status and helplessness. No spray, no anti-lice shampoo, just brushes, fireplace ash, and prayers. Maids once competed to scratch the queen's head, looking for tiny traitors. One day, Catherine heard a faint clicking inside her collar. Not a necklace, just lice partying. Peter didn't care. He wore armor, slept in it, and let lice share power by rank. One night, she felt a bug bite her shoulder. It didn't die. Came back 3 times like it was teaching patience. If you think the palace had pest control, well, they got fired for even suggesting it to Peter. Catherine once requested bed curtains. They hung them, but the bugs climbed anyway. Imagine sleeping in winter, under dirty blankets, with bedbugs roaming like they're on a picnic. One old servant said, "They bite without leaving marks. That's the sign of noble bugs." In court, there were traitors and gossips, but bugs were the most loyal. Catherine learned not to move while sleeping. Any twitch signaled party time to the insects. Once she lit a candle under her bed to smoke them out. Her room ended up smelling like burnt fur. Some nobles used dried flowers, musk, pine resin to mask the smell and the scratching sounds. When meeting foreigners, Catherine always kept distance, not for etiquette, but to avoid spreading lice. Thinking, isn't this exaggerated? Nope. Medical records of the time called lice a nationwide feature. There was even a rule: don't inspect someone's hair in front of the Tsar, because everyone knew they had lice. Each morning, her maid picked lice from Catherine's clothes like fishing from a stream. One day, she caught Peter scratching his head. He didn't stop, because to him, it was an internal royal matter. You could lose your title if lice showed up at an official banquet, but you wouldn't be punished if you knew their names. Peter once named a few of his pet bedbugs, so-called noble status, didn't exempt you from nature's embrace. And Catherine understood power was one thing, but sleeping without bites was the real privilege. She began seeing insects as allies. They didn't gossip, didn't plot, just drank blood. Ironically, in Russia's grandest palace, you shared a bed with bugs, and no one asked your opinion. So if you're scratching your head watching this, don't worry. We don't bite. We just tell history. Catherine had no days off. No Christmas, no birthdays. Just rituals, fake smiles, and ceremonies longer than a Russian winter. Every morning, she had to smile. Not from joy, but because people checked her lips to see if they were cracked, as rumored. Every cough raised suspicion. Was she signaling rebel factions? At every meal, she didn't know if she was being poisoned. But refusing to eat would be seen as rude. And every night, when candles went out, Catherine didn't dream because dreaming was a luxury. She no longer asked, "When will I be happy?" Only, "Am I still alive?" Peter grew colder, vanishing into military drills or chatting. With wooden soldier statues, Catherine wrote letters, none were answered. The court censored faster than the post office. She read philosophy under the blanket, memorizing ideas like survival codes. When she couldn't speak, she learned to listen. When she couldn't argue, she learned to write. Every time her tooth ached, she didn't dare call the doctor, for fear of being accused of abusing privilege. Every time she saw blood in the sink, she wiped it and smiled as if nothing had happened. Every time a servant was replaced, she didn't ask why. Sometimes, they didn't disappear. They were turned into warnings. Peter once said, "Russia needs discipline, not emotion." Catherine learned that in the harshest way. When her body weakened, they called her lazy. When she was healthy, they suspected conspiracy. When she stayed silent, they said she was cold. When she spoke up, they called her a troublemaker. She lived between two rumors. One claimed she was an angel, the other, a spy. But no one asked, "How do you feel?" Because feelings weren't recorded in history. You know someone's breaking when they stop writing diaries. Catherine kept writing, but never let anyone read them. Once, she stared at herself in the mirror for over an hour, trying to remember her childhood face. She couldn't, because in this palace, every day was the same, cold, long, and without reason to look forward. One day, when she couldn't cry anymore, she realized she had entered a new phase, surviving without feeling. And surviving without feeling is the highest form of endurance. She stopped calling for help. She started remembering, because memory was the only thing they couldn't steal. Every time Peter praised loyalty, she wondered, was he talking about his toy soldiers or about her? When she heard someone was punished, she wasn't shocked. She just counted one more, and she was still here. Catherine learned that hope is what gets you caught off guard. So she quietly wrapped up each dream, tucking them deep like one hides a blade in a boot. She didn't rebel. She didn't run. She just waited for the right moment. Because the longest survivors in history aren't the strongest. They're the ones who know how to wait. In the faint candlelight, Catherine blinked once. Not from tiredness, but because she had begun to see the path. And you, if you're still watching, can probably feel it too. Endurance is not weakness. It's the only way to turn yourself from a victim into the one who rewrites fate. Maybe you felt tired, stayed silent, lost hope. But Catherine, in a cold room inside a maze-like court, was still there, not to cry, but to rise on a destined day. Don't think this is a sad ending. It's just the silence before the storm. Because that endurance, that's what made Catherine the Great. And you're still here, aren't you? How many minutes has it been? What time is it now? If you're still here, maybe you're like Catherine too. You didn't leave even though you could. And if that's true, just maybe, you're ready for what comes next. If you're rewatching this or sharing the link with someone, then let me say thank you. Catherine would continue to endure for a while longer. But after that, everything would turn. Don't look away, because when she rises, history changes course. And you, the one still sitting here, are about to witness it. We'll continue after a bit of music. But before that, have you taken a breath? You can pause, get some water, or simply remind yourself, I'm okay. because the journey is just beginning, and you, like Catherine, have already passed the hardest part. Now let's move forward together to the next part, when one girl decides to bring down an empire. Night didn't fall with moonlight, but with knocking room checks, body checks. Catherine lay on the bed like a statue placed there temporarily. No one asked if she wanted to sleep. The royal chamber was so cold even breath turned to frost. But she didn't shiver anymore, her body was used to it. The pillow was stuffed with fine goose feathers, yet never enough to muffle her own sighs. In the dark, bedbugs crawled across silk, their crunch like quiet mockery. Catherine didn't pray, not because she'd lost faith, but because God seemed busy elsewhere. A servant brought in tea, hands trembling, eyes downcast, as if afraid of shattering the air itself. The tea was cold, but the gaze was burning, full of things no one dared say. Catherine said thank you, just 2 words, but the most genuine she could offer all day. Every night, she looked into the mirror, not to put on makeup, but to check if she was still herself. What happened that made God decide to destroy the 2 cities of Sodom and Gomorrah with fire from heaven? This is not just an ancient story, but a lesson that still holds true for us today. Sodom and Gomorrah were once bustling, prosperous cities. The people there lived with their families, traded in the markets, and built homes just like any other community. Yet behind that lively facade was a truly dire reality. Over time, the hearts of the people grew cold. Their actions became increasingly depraved, exceeding the limits of what God could tolerate. Even so, God did not rush to punish them. He sent 2 angels to remind and warn them. But instead of repenting, the people sought to harm those messengers. And then the fateful night arrived. God decided to rain down fire and brimstone from heaven, completely consuming the 2 cities and bringing an end to a tragedy beyond saving. That terrible ending compels us to ask, what truly led them to disaster? Was it the fault of a few individuals, or did the whole community contribute to the tragedy? In today's video, we will look back at the 5 greatest sins that Sodom and Gomorrah committed, things not only of the past but still present in society today. Before we begin, don't forget to like and subscribe to the channel so you won't miss our next stories. Well, perhaps we should start with the first sin, rampant immorality. In Sodom, sin wasn't confined to a corner. It was deeply rooted in the lives of the people, creeping into every alley and daily action. The entire city had nearly forgotten the meaning of purity and goodness. The Bible, in Genesis 19, records that God sent 2 angels to Sodom, disguised as strangers. They came to see with their own eyes, giving the city one last chance to repent. Lot, a man who kept his righteousness amidst the sin, welcomed them into his home. He showed hospitality and reverence for God in a society that had strayed from goodness. But as night fell, something terrible happened. A large crowd, both young and old, gathered outside Lot's house, surrounding it in the dark. They shouted, demanding that Lot bring the strangers out. But their intent was not to welcome, it was to commit unspeakable immoral acts. The sin here was no longer the act of a single lost individual. It was an entire community that had lost its conscience, joining together to enable evil, regardless of the consequences. In the Bible, their words carried a far darker meaning than that of a simple encounter. The people of Sodom no longer cared for kindness, hospitality, or respect for others. They were driven by the desire to dominate, to control, and to impose power on others at any cost. This was no longer merely about lust. It was a sign that the entire society had lost respect for human dignity and the sacredness of life itself. Even worse, those guests were none other than the holy messengers sent by God. Yet the people of Sodom showed no fear or respect, not even before those sent by the Lord. They defiled values that should have been preserved: hospitality, honor, and the foundations upon which their society was once built. We must ask ourselves, is today's society heading down that same path? A world where the line between right and wrong is blurred, where respect and human dignity are easily trampled. In Sodom, the gift God gave humanity, the sacred bond of love between man and woman, was perverted. The union between man and woman was no longer a pure connection but had become a tool for violence, domination, and depravity. God's original intention was for human love to reflect compassion, commitment, and purity. But in Sodom, that sacred bond had become a crude mockery, completely opposed to the Creator's will. When we reread this story, we can see shadows of Sodom in our society today, when purity is scorned, when what was once condemned is now celebrated and encouraged. We live in an age where moral boundaries are more fragile than ever. Sacred values preserved for generations are easily disregarded and mocked. Many may think the story of Sodom is just a piece of ancient history. But if today's society no longer cherishes purity and the sacred, what will the outcome be? Will God one day say, "Enough"? The destruction of Sodom came not only from their evil deeds, but from their hardened hearts, their arrogance, and their blindness to the consequences of their actions. When people can no longer see what is sacred, no longer discern what is right, that is when God intervenes. This story reminds us that disregarding the sacred always comes at a price. And so, the most important question the story leaves us: are we wise enough today to recognize and avoid repeating the sins of Sodom? Let us ask ourselves, in this life, how many times have we crossed the boundary of what is right, even just a little? And how many times have we taken the sacred lightly, until we are lost in the darkness and can no longer see the light? God's judgment upon Sodom was harsh, but it was justice. It was not a hasty decision, but the result of centuries of warnings that they stubbornly ignored. Thus, Sodom and Gomorrah became symbols of what happens when sin piles up beyond redemption. Their destruction reminds us of the devastating power of moral decay and the importance of preserving what is sacred and pure. When we look at ourselves, at the society around us, the question arises: are we gradually walking the same path Sodom once did? What values do we truly represent? Do we have the courage to stand up for what is good and sacred? The choice has always been in our hands. Like Lot, we must remain steadfast in our faith, even when the world around us is sinking into depravity. And now, we move on to the second great sin that led to the fall of Sodom: pride and arrogance. This was a silent but dangerous kind of pride, which made the people no longer see the moral decline within themselves. Many years after Sodom's destruction, a prophet named Ezekiel reminded us why the city was punished by God. In his book, Ezekiel 16 verse 49, he wrote, "The sin of your sister Sodom was pride, excessive food, and prosperous ease, but did not aid the poor and needy." These words show us clearly. Sodom was a wealthy city, having everything, but they lost the most important things: humility, kindness, and compassion. Pride is very dangerous. It doesn't always show itself outwardly. Often, it quietly creeps in, silently corrupting people and gradually causing society to rot from within. The people of Sodom were self-satisfied with their wealth and comforts. They believed they were superior, untouchable, needing to care for no one else. They had abundant wealth, full storehouses, and leisure time to indulge themselves. But instead of using these to help the poor or glorify God, they focused only on themselves and looked down on others. Pride blinded their conscience, making them forget the values they should have upheld: humility, kindness, and sharing with those weaker than themselves. It's easy to picture such a society. Rich, full of abundance, but then arrogant and indifferent, no longer thinking of their responsibility to the community and to God. Today, let us ask, how many times have we seen this silent pride take root in our own society? When life is smooth, when blessings surround us, it's easy for people to forget the one who gave them those blessings. In times of plenty, we easily think that all we have is by our own efforts, that we need no one, not even God. But the Bible constantly warns of the danger of such thinking. Remember ancient Babylon. Because of pride, they thought they were everything, that no one could touch them. Isaiah 47 verse 8 says, "You say, 'I am, and there is no one besides me. I shall not sit as a widow or know the loss of children.' Yet in a single night, that mighty Babylon fell completely, just as God had said. The same happened to Egypt, a land once proud of its strength and wealth, but brought low by the hand of God. Even the great king Nebuchadnezzar of Babylon had to endure years of madness, until at last he humbly acknowledged God's absolute power. Pride creeps in so cleverly. It inflates the human ego, making us believe we can be self-sufficient, decide everything without God. The false sense of being invincible is the most dangerous thing, because it draws people away from God and into destruction without them realizing it. Looking at history, looking at the world today, I feel all the more that humility before God, gratitude for what we have, is truly the foundation that keeps both individuals and communities strong. As the people of Sodom grew more and more arrogant, they began to believe they could not be judged, that they stood above any punishment from God. The saddest thing about pride is that it blinds people to the emptiness in their own souls. The people of Sodom thought they had everything: wealth, status, worldly pleasures. But in truth, they were utterly bankrupt in spirit. They no longer saw their deepest need, to need God, to need His guidance and mercy. When we put all our trust in temporary wealth and comforts, we risk becoming like Sodom, blinded by pride, self-satisfied, and gradually losing our way. Let us ask ourselves, how much have we let pride shape our lives? Do we still trust in God's care, or rely only on our abilities and possessions? The story of Sodom and Gomorrah is a powerful reminder. Pride, whether silent or blatant, leads to ruin. The people of Sodom thought they could not be touched. But God's judgment came swiftly, and their fate is a costly lesson for all generations. I believe that only by being awake, humble, and returning to God can we avoid the mistakes that Sodom made. This is not just a story of the past. It still shines a light on our present reality. Pride always leads to destruction, and God will humble those who refuse to acknowledge their dependence on His power. Are we being vigilant about this? Are we humble enough to admit that without God, we are nothing? Or are we, like Sodom, drawing near to spiritual emptiness while thinking we are full? And now we come to the third great sin of Sodom, the lack of hospitality. This was one of the reasons the city was destroyed by God. In ancient society, hospitality was not just courtesy or a kind gesture. It was a sacred duty, deeply embedded in the foundation of culture and way of life. When a stranger entered the town, people had the responsibility to provide food, water, shelter, and protection. This was not just an obligation, but a way to show compassion and care for the vulnerable. Hospitality was a mirror reflecting the compassion of a community. It showed that they respected the values God wanted humanity to uphold: love and protection for one another. But sadly, Sodom had completely lost this, and that was part of the reason the city suffered such a severe fate. In the Bible, welcoming a stranger was not just politeness. It was an act of respect, because sometimes the stranger was a guest sent by God. The presence of the divine could appear in the form of a traveler. But in Sodom, the opposite happened. When two angels disguised as humans entered the city, they were not welcomed but became targets of violence. The people of Sodom, from young to old, gathered outside Lot's house. Instead of protecting the guests, they pressured him to hand them over. Their intention came not from hospitality. They sought to harm, abuse, and humiliate the innocent guests. A meeting that should have been peaceful turned into a night of horror. They not only failed in their sacred duty, but committed a profound sin, betraying the values God taught about love and protection for the vulnerable. Hospitality reflected God's own kindness. He is the one who always opens His arms to welcome and protect those in need. In the Bible, as written in Hebrews 13 verse 2, "Do not forget to show hospitality to strangers, for by so doing some people have shown hospitality to angels without knowing it." Sodom rejected this sacred duty and bore the consequences. This story reminds us of the lasting value of hospitality and the consequences of turning away from what God wants humanity to uphold. Welcoming strangers is not just courtesy but a sacred obligation. It is a way to respect others as if they are guests sent by God. Often, the presence of the divine appears in the form of a stranger. In Sodom, everything went in the opposite direction. When two angels disguised as strangers entered the city, the people of Sodom did not welcome them. Sodom's rejection of hospitality became proof of their deep fall, and part of the reason for the destruction they suffered. When the people treated the guests violently, it was not just an insult to moral and cultural standards, but a direct betrayal of what God taught about how people should treat one another. This was not merely a lack of courtesy. It was a rejection of the loving and caring nature that God wants humanity to reflect. God values hospitality because it clearly reflects His love and care for everyone. A nation that fails this test loses the ability to reflect God's image in the world. In modern society, we sometimes forget the true value of hospitality. Many close their hearts to strangers, hesitant to reach out and help. Yet the way we treat others, especially the vulnerable or strangers, is the measure of our heart and our faith. In a society filled with division, suspicion, and judgment, opening our hearts in hospitality is not just kindness, but a reflection of God's heart. The people of Sodom failed completely in this test. They not only refused to welcome, but attacked and humiliated those who should have been protected. And that choice sealed their fate: destruction. In truth, the rejection of hospitality by the people of Sodom was not just an accidental act. It was a reflection of souls that had grown cold, losing care and compassion. Each time we close our hearts and fail to welcome a stranger, we may not realize it, but we are moving away from God's teaching, to love others as He loves us. So what about us today? When we face strangers, the marginalized, or those different from us, what attitude will we choose? Will we be ready to smile at them, extend a helping hand, or will we shut the door, thinking only of our own comfort and safety, forgetting the suffering of others? The lesson from Sodom poses a great question. How do we respond to those in need of shelter and love? The reality today is that many still live in hardship and loneliness. The ancient story urges us not only to think, but to act with love and kindness. Are we opening our hearts to others, or are we gradually closing ourselves off from the world? Does our heart still reflect God's kindness, or has indifference, like in Sodom, taken over? The fourth great sin that led to the fall of Sodom was the oppression of the poor and ignoring the needy. This was not just a momentary act of indifference, but an attitude deeply ingrained in their society. The prophet Ezekiel emphasized this failure. He said, "This was the sin of your sister Sodom. She and her daughters were arrogant, overfed, and unconcerned. They did not help the poor and needy." Ezekiel 16 verse 49. These words speak not only of Sodom's material abundance, but accuse them of turning a blind eye to those truly in need of compassion. Throughout the Bible, God reminds us that He loves the poor, the oppressed, and the forgotten. He instructed His people, share with the hungry, protect the widow, and care for the orphan. Isaiah 1 verse 17. These are not fleeting commands or meant for a specific time. They are the basic foundation of the kingdom of God, the way He wants humanity to reflect His loving heart in this life. God's justice and mercy always go hand in hand. He desires that we care for and uplift the weak, those who cannot care for themselves. But in Sodom, this was forgotten. The people lived in wealth with abundant food and possessions, more than enough to share. Yet they chose to close their hearts, refusing to help those in need. It was not accidental. They deliberately chose comfort while ignoring the suffering around them. That indifference was not a small mistake, but a cold, selfish choice. That heartlessness made God angry, because when we turn our backs on the poor and weak, we also turn our backs on God, who always sides with the abandoned and oppressed. This is not just a story of a few individuals' faults. It is the collapse of an entire society. God did not just warn individuals, but called the whole community to account for living unjustly, for neglecting mercy, and letting the poor suffer while they enjoyed wealth. Throughout history, we see this clearly in Israel and many other nations. Whenever they oppressed the poor or turned from justice, God sent prophets to warn them. Ezekiel 22 verse 29 says, God strongly condemned the leaders of Israel because they exploited and oppressed the poor, those who could not defend themselves. Similar judgments fell on nations like Edom, Tyre, and many others for not heeding the cries of the weak. Today, we also witness a world full of poverty, deprivation, and injustice. How many people need shelter, a meal, medical care, and how often have we, who are able, chosen silence, ignoring their suffering? Every time we are indifferent and fail to act, we repeat Sodom's mistake. We become complicit in lovelessness and lack of compassion. Let's reflect. Does the way we live reflect God's heart of justice and mercy? The people of Sodom had surplus wealth and the means to help, but they chose to turn away from those who needed saving. They lived in wealth and abundance while others suffered and lacked. It's sad to realize that today, we might be following that same path. How often do we see injustice yet choose silence? How often do we become part of a system that maintains injustice? God still calls us. Live with a nobler heart, care for the poor and oppressed. Be the embodiment of mercy and justice in this world. Reading this, ask yourself, what have you done to support those in trouble? Does your way of life reflect God's righteousness? Are you ready to open your heart to the weak, or has fear or selfishness closed it? The story of Sodom is not just a tragedy of the distant past. It still echoes as a wake-up call for all of us today. The fifth and final sin that sealed Sodom and Gomorrah's fate was rebellion against God and refusal to repent. This was not simply about making a few mistakes in life. It was a public challenge to the Creator. The people of Sodom did not sin out of weakness or ignorance. They deliberately chose wrong, took pride in their sinful acts, and had no intention of changing. There was no remorse in their hearts. They stubbornly refused every call to return to righteousness. Perhaps this hardness of heart and defiant attitude hurt God most. God, rich in mercy, patiently gave them time and warned them many times. He even listened to Abraham's plea, agreeing to spare the city if just 10 righteous people could be found. But sadly, not even a small group meeting that standard could be found. The city was so steeped in sin that not a few good people remained. This was not just the failure of individuals but the complete moral collapse of an entire society. A community had strayed so far from righteousness that destruction became inevitable. This story forces us to reflect. Is integrity still upheld in our society today? Are we becoming like Sodom, as hearts grow harder against God's call? Even Lot, who lived among the people of Sodom, tried his best to warn his sons-in-law. He pleaded with them to leave the city before disaster struck. But instead of listening, Lot's sons-in-law mocked him. They thought the warning was ridiculous, not worth paying attention to. In their eyes, nothing serious was about to happen. They ignored their final chance to change, the chance to escape a tragic fate. Today, we often witness people dismissing warnings, mocking the idea of judgment, and thinking that life will remain peaceful as it is, despite all signs calling for awakening. The problem wasn't just individual. It was an entire community that hardened its heart against God's call for repentance. Even when God's angels appeared before them, they still refused to step back or change. They continued to plunge into sin, lost in darkness, unable or unwilling to see the light of truth right before them. This is what broke God's heart. For God, full of patience and mercy, had given them so many chances to turn back. But when they rejected everything, refusing to change despite being warned time and again, judgment became inevitable. Then fire and brimstone rained down from heaven, consuming everything. The cities that once brimmed with life, once echoed with children's laughter, the warmth of homes, the voices of a thriving community, were now nothing but smoking ashes. Today, does God still give us such opportunities? Every day we wake up is a new opportunity to return to Him, to leave wrong paths behind and turn our hearts toward the light. Yet how many times have we wasted those opportunities? How often have we ignored the warning signs, telling ourselves we have plenty of time, that consequences are far off, or that we will not have to bear them? The story of Sodom and Gomorrah reminds us that a time will come when warnings stop, when the door of mercy closes and judgment arrives. When Lot and his family fled the city, the angel gave them clear instructions. Do not look back. Run to save your lives. That message was simple but powerful. Escape destruction. Do not cling to a sinful past. But as the family fled, something heartbreaking happened. Lot's wife, though warned, turned back to look at the city. In her heart, she still longed for the old life, still clung to the sinful past. And in that moment, she became a pillar of salt. Her fate is a bitter reminder to us all. Even when God grants us a chance at deliverance, if we keep longing for what we should leave behind, consequences will follow. When Lot's wife looked back, She was longing for the very things that had led the city to ruin. Her story reminds us, repentance is not just about outward actions but about freeing the heart from attachment to sin. In daily life, how often do we feel torn between the old life God calls us to leave and the better life He offers? How often do we still cling to the past even knowing God wants us to move forward? The image of Lot's wife is a wake-up call. Her failure was not that she couldn't run, but that she couldn't let go of what she should have left behind. God had opened a new path for her, but she could not fully step into it. This is the greatest tragedy of rebellion. The final act of the people of Sodom, refusing to repent despite clear warnings, is what led to their destruction. God's patience finally ended, and then judgment was carried out. Fire and brimstone from heaven completely destroyed the once mighty cities. But the greatest tragedy was not the external destruction, but the death within the souls of those who refused to hear God's call. The question for us today remains, will we listen to God's warning? Will we dare to abandon the rebellion in our hearts? Or will we, like Sodom, ignore every warning until it's too late? We still witness today a society breaking moral boundaries, celebrating what goes against God's plan for humanity. There remains the pride that makes people deceive themselves into thinking they don't need God, that they can steer their lives without His guidance. We still easily close our hearts, indifferent to strangers, refusing to open our doors and share kindness, forgetting that hospitality reflects God's love. The poor, the vulnerable, and those in need are still around us every day. Yet many times we turn a blind eye, forgetting that God deeply cares for these people. And the saddest part is that many still live in rebellion, turning their backs on God's loving call to repentance. But remember, God does not change. He is still loving, and still desires to save those willing to return to Him. And though God's justice will surely come, His mercy remains wide open for those who truly return to Him. Just as He once sent angels to warn the people of Sodom, today He continues to remind us, giving us opportunities to leave the wrong path. Before the fire fell to consume Sodom, God gave them time, opened opportunities, but they rejected them all. And the lesson here is clear. God is full of patience, but that patience does not last forever. One day His justice will be done, but if we repent, His mercy is ready to receive us. After that terrible destruction, Lot and his daughters found refuge in a small town called Zor. By God's mercy, Zor was spared from judgment, and it became their temporary shelter. Genesis 19 verse 22. But that peace did not last long. Lot became afraid, fearing that Zor might also suffer the same fate as Sodom. So he took his family up into the mountains and lived in a cave to avoid danger. Genesis 19 verse 30. What seemed like the beginning of peace and recovery actually opened a new tragedy. In loneliness and fear, Lot's daughters worried that their family line would come to an end forever. In their desperation, they made a plan. They got their father drunk and lay with him to preserve their lineage. A plan born of fear that led to a sorrowful chapter in Lot's family story. This is not just a story of escape and survival. It is a serious reminder of what can happen when people do not fully abandon what is tied to sin, even after being saved. From that tragic act, 2 children were born, Moab and Ben-Ammi. These children later became the ancestors of the Moabites and Ammonites, nations that became lifelong enemies of Israel. Genesis 19 verses 36 to 38. This story speaks not only of moral failure but clearly reflects the consequences of sin. Consequences that can cling to people even after they have been delivered. Though Lot and his daughters were spared from the terrifying destruction of Sodom, the emotional wounds, fears, and moral failures continued to weigh heavily on them. This is a warning that even after God reaches out in salvation, we can still stumble if we continue to cling to a sinful past or let fear lead us instead of faith. Sadly, the Bible does not clearly record Lot's feelings or reaction after that painful event. We can only imagine that he carried deep sorrow, perhaps regret and disappointment over himself and what had happened. Though Lot was saved from Sodom's destruction by God, it is clear he did not completely change. The psychological scars and consequences of his family's sin continued to haunt and affect his life. This story reminds us of an important truth. Being saved from destruction is not enough to completely erase the consequences of sin. God's forgiveness is the beginning, but true healing and transformation must come from a change of heart. The salvation God offers is not just to spare us from punishment. It is an invitation to live a new life, a life that leaves behind sinful pasts, releases fear, and lets go of old habits to truly walk in faith. For if our hearts still carry unhealed wounds, we can still fall, still be pulled back by the past. Lot's fear and his daughter's moral fall show the inner battles many of us face even after God rescues us from sin. God can open the way for us to escape danger, but we must choose to leave behind the sinful past so that the renewal he wants to bring can take root in our hearts. Have we opened our hearts to receive his work of renewal? God's grace is always ready, but we must truly receive it and allow him to complete his work in our lives. This story is not meant to frighten anyone, but to awaken us. It invites us to reflect on our lives, our society, and our hearts. I would love to hear your thoughts and feelings after revisiting this story together. Share them, because when we reflect together, we can learn from the past and make better choices for the future. If today's message has touched your heart, don't forget to share this video so others can also be reminded, and subscribe to the channel to join me on this journey of exploring the Bible and life-changing lessons. Don't let this moment pass by without meaning. Seize this opportunity to reflect, to return, and to seek God's mercy while the door of grace is still open. God calls us to live by his truth, to let his mercy shape and transform us into the people he desires us to be. Let us learn from the lesson of the past. Do not let it repeat in our lives. Decide today that we will return to God, live meaningfully, and walk firmly on the path he has set for us. Time is precious. Use it wisely so that when we look back, we have no regrets, but see that we have lived according to what God desires. December 25th each year, Christmas, is also the day we commemorate the birth of Jesus Christ. However, none of the Gospels actually mention this specific date. So why do we celebrate on this day? And more importantly, when was Jesus really born? To find the answer, let's take a look at the carefully recorded details in the Holy Scriptures. There are 7 key facts to consider, and when pieced together, they provide a clearer picture of Jesus' birth. Today, I invite you to open this sacred book with me, to study and uncover truths preserved for over 2,000 years. Before we begin, leave your guess in the comments, and don't forget to like and subscribe to not miss future videos. The first clue we find is in the Gospel of Luke, referring to the famous census at that time. During the reign of Caesar Augustus, he ordered a massive empire-wide census. This is considered the first census conducted while Quirinius was governor of Syria. Everyone had to return to their hometown to register and declare their information by imperial order. The Romans were known for precision and control. They used censuses like this to govern, collect taxes, and ensure no one escaped their system. These censuses weren't just paperwork. They were tools to display the empire's power, forcing even the lowest to submit. But the amazing thing is, while Augustus believed he was in control, it was God who was using these events to fulfill his divine plan. This census inadvertently caused thousands to travel, including a small family carrying the Savior of the world. Joseph, of the lineage of David, had to return to Bethlehem with Mary, who was pregnant with Jesus, just as the old prophecy had written. The journey from Nazareth to Bethlehem was about 80 miles, a tough trip even for the healthy. For Mary, heavily pregnant, the journey was especially exhausting and difficult. What they may have seen as a burden was actually a part of God's larger plan. Over 700 years earlier, the prophet Micah declared, "But you, Bethlehem Ephrathah, though you are small among the clans of Judah, out of you will come a ruler for Israel." Through the Roman emperor's decree, this prophecy was fulfilled when Jesus was born in Bethlehem. Additionally, there's another important detail many overlook: the weather conditions in Judea at that time. Winter in that region is cold and damp, not suitable for long travel or conducting a census. This suggests that Jesus may not have been born in the middle of winter, as commonly believed. Logically, this census likely took place in spring or fall, when the weather was milder and travel was easier. Moreover, these times coincided with major gatherings in the Jewish calendar. like harvest season or large festivals. These were occasions when people were already used to traveling and gathering in large numbers. Remarkably, the very tool of imperial control became the means by which God carried out his plan. Caesar Augustus, intending to manage his vast empire, unwittingly set the stage for the most significant event in human history, the birth of the Messiah. This census was not a coincidence, but God's way of ensuring his son was born in the right place, at the right time as foretold. Joseph and Mary had no idea that every step toward Bethlehem was fulfilling ancient prophecy. Caesar Augustus, too, was unaware that his decree was part of a divine, preordained plan. Through this, we clearly see how God arranges historical events, even the most mundane, to fulfill his purposes. Jesus wasn't born in a place chosen by man, but in one divinely appointed from the beginning. While the Roman Empire controlled every aspect of life, God's supreme power quietly moved his plan forward. This census reminds us that even when man thinks he is in charge, a divine plan is unfolding in perfect detail. From this census, we understand that Jesus was likely not born in winter, a time not ideal for travel or administrative tasks. A more fitting time would be spring or fall, when weather conditions allowed for easier movement and gatherings. Now, let's move on to the second clue, which involves the father of John the Baptist. This clue begins with an important detail. Zechariah, John's father, was a priest in the division of Abijah. One day, while he was burning incense in the temple, an angel appeared to him with news. His wife Elizabeth, though old and barren, would bear a child. That child would be John the Baptist, the one who would go before and prepare the way for the Messiah. This is where it gets interesting, because the timing of this event gives us a surprising clue to estimate the birth of Jesus. Zechariah's temple service is one of the most important clues to determining when Jesus was born. According to the Gospel of Luke, during the reign of King Herod of Judea, there was a priest named Zechariah, from the division of Abijah. When it was the turn of the Abijah division to serve in the temple, Zechariah was ministering before the Lord, as was customary. The priests of Israel were divided into 24 divisions, each serving 1 week twice a year, as recorded in 1 Chronicles 24. Zechariah's division was the 8th, which typically served around May or June. During this time of service, the angel Gabriel appeared to Zechariah and told him that his wife Elizabeth would conceive. Later, Luke chapter 1 says that 6 months after Elizabeth conceived, the angel Gabriel appeared to Mary and told her she would be the mother of Jesus. This suggests that Mary conceived around November or December. Adding 9 months of pregnancy, Jesus was likely born around September or October. Interestingly, this time frame coincides with the Feast of Tabernacles, one of the most significant Jewish festivals. The Feast of Tabernacles was held to commemorate God's presence among the Israelites during their wilderness journey. It's possible that Jesus, called Emmanuel, meaning God with us, was born during this very festival. This is a meaningful thought because it ties Jesus' birth to the Jewish calendar and to deep theological symbolism, as if every detail had been part of God's meticulous plan from the beginning. The story of Zechariah may seem isolated at first, but it's actually a crucial part of the grand picture God was painting. Every word in the Bible has meaning and is placed precisely. Nothing is random. This small detail further illustrates God's perfect plan, leaving no room for error, and it gives us yet another clue linking Jesus' birth to an important Jewish festival. The third clue relates to the Feast of Tabernacles and the surprising connection between Jesus' birth and Jewish festivals. The Israelites lived by a calendar full of holidays, not just to remember their history, but to reflect on greater truths, like the arrival of the Messiah. Each of these festivals carried deep spiritual meaning, and some remarkably align with possible dates for Jesus' birth. As we've seen, Jesus may have been born during the Feast of Tabernacles, one of the holiest events in the Jewish calendar. The Feast of Tabernacles, or Sukkot, commemorates the time when God dwelled among the Israelites in tents during their journey out of Egypt. This festival takes place in autumn, around September or October, as a time of joy, gratitude, and reflection on God's presence. There is another Bible verse that supports this theory. In the first chapter of the Gospel of John, we read, "The Word became flesh and dwelt among us. We have seen his glory, the glory of the one and only Son, who came from the Father, full of grace and truth. What's fascinating is that in the original Greek, the word dwelt can also be translated as tabernacled. So what better time for God to truly dwell among his people than during the Feast of Tabernacles? Moreover, Jewish festivals are not only commemorations of the past, but also prophetic symbols of future events. For example, Passover is associated with the death of Jesus, who is called the Lamb of God. Pentecost coincided with the outpouring of the Holy Spirit. If these major events aligned with Jewish festivals, it's logical to think that Jesus' birth might align with a significant feast as well. Another festival possibly related to Jesus' birth is Rosh Hashanah, the Jewish New Year, also held in the fall. It marks a new beginning and invites people to reflect on God's kingship. The sound of the shofar during this time calls for repentance and proclaims God's sovereignty, a fitting setting for the birth of the King of Kings. When Jesus came into the world, he ushered in a new era, a new covenant and a new hope for all humanity. Everything in God's plan was perfectly arranged, like a symphony where every note is in its rightful place. The idea that Jesus' birth coincided with a Jewish festival shows this was no random event. This event is closely tied to the historical tradition and spiritual expectations of the people of Israel. However, we need to consider two other clues in the Bible related to the time after Mary gave birth to Jesus. The fourth clue involves the shepherds. In the Gospel of Luke, there is an important detail about the night Jesus was born that we may have heard but not deeply thought about. The scripture says, "There were shepherds living out in the fields nearby, keeping watch over their flocks at night. An angel of the Lord appeared to them, and the glory of the Lord shone around them, and they were terrified." This story offers a key clue to help us better understand the season in which Jesus was born. It was nighttime, and the shepherds were out in the fields watching their flocks under the starry skies of Judea. December in this region is typically cold, with damp nights and extended rain. This is the time when shepherds usually look for shelter for their flocks, avoiding open fields. Therefore, the idea of shepherds staying outside in winter to watch over their flocks doesn't align with local customs or weather conditions. This detail pushes us to consider another season of the year, possibly spring, summer, or fall. Spring is lambing season, the weather is mild, and nights are cool but not too harsh. Summer nights are warm, and shepherds often lead their flocks out to enjoy the cooler air after hot days. In fall, during harvest time, shepherds still keep their flocks out in the fields thanks to the still moderate weather. In winter, however, nighttime grazing is uncommon and quite challenging. What's fascinating is that such a small story detail can reveal an important truth about the timing of Jesus' birth. If the shepherds were out in the fields watching their flocks, it strongly suggests Jesus was unlikely born in December. But there is another clue that appears on the night Jesus was born: the Star of Bethlehem. The Star of Bethlehem is one of the most mysterious and captivating elements of the Nativity story. In Matthew chapter 2, we read that after Jesus was born in Bethlehem, wise men from the east came to Jerusalem and asked, "Where is the one who has been born King of the Jews? We saw his star when it rose." But what exactly was this star? Was it a natural phenomenon, a divine sign, or perhaps both? Either way, the star marked the exact time when the heavens announced that something extraordinary had taken place on earth. To shed light on this mystery, many have tried to identify astronomical events that may have occurred at that time. One of the most common theories about the Star of Bethlehem is that it was a planetary conjunction. This phenomenon happens when two planets, such as Jupiter and Saturn, align in the sky to form a bright point of light. According to astronomical calculations, such a conjunction occurred around 7 BC, approximately when Jesus is believed to have been born. Another theory suggests the star could have been a nova or supernova, an exploding star that shines brightly for weeks or months, enough to draw attention from anyone watching the sky. However, to this day, there are no historical records confirming such an astronomical event at that time. Some believe the star may have been a comet, a celestial body moving through the sky, which seemed to lead the wise men on their journey. However, at that time, comets were usually seen as bad omens, not symbols of hope, so it's unlikely that the Star of Bethlehem was a comet. What makes the story even more fascinating is that the star didn't just appear for observation. It had a purpose: to guide the wise men. The wise men didn't just see the star. They followed it until they arrived at the exact place where Jesus was born. This shows that the Star of Bethlehem wasn't just a natural phenomenon, but a special sign used by God to announce the birth of his son. Most importantly, the star wasn't merely a sign in the sky. It was a message to all humanity. The Messiah has arrived. Yet, the religious leaders in Jerusalem ignored the prophetic scriptures about the Messiah. While this very sign caught King Herod's attention, when the wise men asked Herod about the child, they unintentionally alerted him to the existence of the Savior. From that moment, Herod issued one of his most brutal decrees, and this decree gives us another clue about Jesus' birth. The sixth clue involves King Herod and the massacre of the innocents, one of the cruelest events associated with Jesus' birth. According to the book of Matthew, the Magi followed the star to Jerusalem, assuming the newborn king would be in Herod's palace. They asked Herod, "Where is the one who has been born king of the Jews? We saw his star in the east and have come to worship him." Herod told them, "Go and search carefully for the child. As soon as you find him, report to me, so that I too may go and worship him." After leaving Jerusalem, the wise men were warned in a dream not to return to Herod. When Herod realized he had been deceived by the wise men, he was furious and ordered the slaughter of all male children aged 2 and under in Bethlehem. Though cruel and inhumane, Herod's decree gives us a significant clue about the timing of Jesus' birth. From this detail, we can estimate a clearer time frame for Jesus' birth. We know that Herod died in 4 BC, meaning the massacre must have occurred shortly before that. If Jesus was under 2 years old at the time, he was likely born between 6 and 4 BC. The historical context supports this. Herod was notorious for his paranoia and brutality, even killing his own family members to secure his throne. When he heard of a new king's birth, his reaction was exactly as expected: eliminate any threat, no matter how innocent. But what Herod didn't know was that this king had not come to take an earthly throne, but to establish a heavenly kingdom no man could stop. Herod's plan failed because Joseph was warned by an angel in a dream and fled with Mary and Jesus to Egypt. This escape not only saved the Savior, but also fulfilled another prophecy: "Out of Egypt I called my son." The scripture says, "When Israel was a child, I loved him, and out of Egypt I called my son." Even the tears of the mothers in Bethlehem had been foretold by the prophet Jeremiah. Jeremiah wrote, "A voice is heard in Ramah, mourning and great weeping, Rachel weeping for her children and refusing to be comforted, because they are no more." Astonishingly, even in the darkness of the massacre, God's plan was perfectly fulfilled. Nothing could stop it. The massacre of the innocents highlights the stark contrast between human cruelty and God's perfect plan. Herod tried to use death to stop life, not knowing the child he feared most would one day conquer death itself. And the final clue to Jesus' birth is revealed through the moment he began his public ministry. According to Luke chapter 3, Jesus was about 30 years old when he began preaching. This is a key detail, not just a biographical note. In fact, this detail helps us pinpoint his birth by counting backward from the start of his ministry. Jesus began his ministry in a specific historical context, during the reign of Emperor Tiberius Caesar. Luke notes that this happened in the 15th year of Tiberius' reign, which historians place around AD 29 or 30. If Jesus was about 30 years old at that time, this places his birth somewhere between 6 and 4 BC. This time frame aligns with the period when Herod the Great was still alive, confirming the Bible's account that Jesus was born during Herod's reign. The connection between these historical and biblical details gives us a strong clue about when the Savior entered the world. But why did Jesus begin his ministry at around age 30? That number is not random. In Jewish tradition, 30 was a significant age, the minimum age for a priest to begin service in the temple, according to Numbers chapter 4. It was also the age when a man was considered fully mature and capable of taking on public and spiritual responsibility. Jesus, though not from the tribe of Levi, presented himself as the eternal high priest, beginning a ministry that would not only change history but open the way of salvation for all humanity. The start of his ministry marked a turning point and invites us to reflect on the 30 silent years he spent in Nazareth. What happened during those 30 years, the years of preparation for his great mission? While the Bible is mostly silent about Jesus' first 30 years, we can imagine them as years of preparation, obedience, and growth. Those years were not wasted. They were the perfect time for Jesus to be fully ready to begin his mission at the appointed moment. Now, let us review the 7 clues that help determine the birth of Jesus. Clue number 1. The conception of John the Baptist occurred around June 6 BC, suggesting Jesus was conceived about 6 months later, around December. This would place Jesus' birth around September or October 5 BC, assuming a full 9-month pregnancy. Clue number 2. The theory that the Star of Bethlehem was a planetary conjunction or astronomical event fits with a date around 6 or 5 BC. Clue number 3. The massacre of infants occurred before Herod's death in 4 BC, confirming that Jesus was born before then. Clue number 4. Jesus began his ministry around AD 28 at about 30 years old, supporting a birth date between 6 and 4 BC. Clue number 5. The shepherds being out in the fields rules out December, since shepherds didn't keep flocks outside during the winter. Clue number 6. The census by Caesar Augustus would have likely taken place in autumn, a more practical season for travel. Clue number 7. The Gospel of John mentions, "The Word dwelt among us," suggesting a connection to the Feast of Tabernacles in September or October. All this evidence points to Jesus being born in September or October of a year before the Common Era, aligning perfectly with historical events and biblical prophecies. The question then arises, why doesn't our calendar year align with the actual year of Jesus' birth? There's a reason why the year 0 doesn't match the true time frame of Jesus' birth, between 6 and 4 BC. The discrepancy stems from a human error made centuries after Jesus' time, when our current calendar system was created. It began in the 6th century, when a monk named Dionysius Exiguus attempted to determine a starting point for history, the year of Christ's birth. Dionysius had noble intentions. He wanted to divide history into 2 parts, before Christ and after Christ. He based his calculations on historical documents and the Gospels, but he didn't have the accurate information we have today. As a result, Dionysius made serious mistakes. He didn't know that Herod the Great, who was still alive at Jesus' birth according to the Gospels, had died in 4 BC. This means that Jesus must have been born before that year. Additionally, the calendar system Dionysius created had no year 0. It jumped from 1 BC to AD 1, further skewing the chronology. Ironically, although Dionysius miscalculated, his system was quickly adopted and became the foundation of the calendar we still use today. Changing this system now is nearly impossible, since millions of historical records, events, and celebrations are based on it. Thus, the world continues to use this calendar system, even though it doesn't reflect the actual year Jesus was born. Still, there is beauty in this. It reminds us that what matters isn't the exact number, but the sacred meaning of the event we celebrate, the arrival of the Messiah. It's fascinating to think that although Dionysius got the year wrong, his effort helped shape history. History still revolves around the most important event, the birth of Jesus. His intent was to mark the most significant moment in human history, the birth of the Savior. Even if the date is off, his system carries timeless influence. So why do many people believe Jesus was born on December 25th? In fact, this belief doesn't come from the Bible but from traditions and decisions made centuries after his birth. In the first 3 centuries of Christianity, there was no agreement on the exact date of Jesus' birth. In fact, early Christians didn't celebrate his birth at all. They focused on his death and resurrection. So why did December 25th become widely accepted? One popular theory connects it to the pagan winter solstice festival held between December 21st to 25th in the Roman Empire. This festival, called Sol Invictus, celebrated the rebirth of the sun after the year's shortest days, symbolizing the victory of light over darkness. That message aligns closely with the message of Christianity. Jesus is the light of the world. When Christianity became the official religion of the Roman Empire under Constantine in the 4th century, Church leaders chose December 25th to replace the pagan festival with a celebration of Jesus' birth. This strategy made it easier for people to embrace Christianity, keeping some familiar customs while shifting the focus to the Savior. Another theory suggests December 25th was based on the idea that Jesus was conceived on March 25th, a date also associated with his crucifixion, and 9 months later is December. However, this calculation isn't based on historical or biblical evidence, but rather on an effort to spiritually connect key moments in Jesus' life with the calendar year. December 25th is not the actual birthday of Jesus, and that's okay. Even the apostles closest to him never celebrated his birthday. What matters is not the exact date, but the meaning we celebrate. Christmas is not just about Jesus' birth. It's about the Incarnation, the greatest miracle humanity has ever known. The Incarnation is when God became man, giving us the gift of salvation, breaking the power of sin, and opening the gates of heaven. I rarely say this, but today I invite you to watch the linked video, The True Meaning of Christmas. It's a message worth understanding and sharing with your family and loved ones. Embrace this message, become a light, and share it with those around you, today and always. Amen.